Before we begin tonight's story, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would mean the world to us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. It truly makes a difference. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Jeff Anon. Thank you, Jeff, for bringing this incredible mystery to our attention. Now, let's begin. The Vela Incident, the nuclear flash that officially never happened. September 22nd, 1979, 3:53 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time, the southern Indian Ocean near the Prince Edward Islands. In the vast darkness above Earth's atmosphere, a United States military satellite recorded something that should not exist. A flash of light, then another, 2 pulses, milliseconds apart. Brilliant, unmistakable. The satellite was not experimental, it was not a prototype. It had been operating flawlessly for years, watching, waiting, scanning the entire surface of the planet for one specific thing: nuclear detonations. The satellite's designation was Vela 6911, and it had just detected what appeared to be an atomic explosion in one of the most remote regions of the planet. But here's the thing about that night, about that flash, about that moment in history. According to the United States government, it never happened. Not officially, not in any way that matters. And that impossibility, that contradiction between what the sensors saw and what the world was told, is where our story truly begins. Chapter 1. The Vela Satellite Program. To understand why the Vela flash matters, you first need to understand what the Vela satellites were built to do. 1963, the height of the Cold War. The United States, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom had just signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, an agreement that prohibited nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. But treaties are only as good as the ability to verify them. How do you prove a nation isn't secretly detonating nuclear weapons in the middle of the ocean, in the depths of the Sahara, in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica? You watch. From space. The Vela satellite program was launched specifically for this purpose. The name Vela comes from the Spanish word meaning watchman, or to keep vigil. These satellites were the watchers, the guardians, the eyes that never blinked. Each Vela satellite carried an array of sensors designed to detect the unique signatures of nuclear explosions. Light sensors called pangmeters measured the intensity and pattern of light flashes. Gamma-ray detectors picked up high-energy radiation. X-ray sensors captured the initial burst of energy. Neutron detectors measured particle emissions. Together, these instruments could identify a nuclear detonation from 22,000 miles away in space. By 1979, the Vela program had been operating for 16 years. The satellites had successfully detected dozens of confirmed nuclear tests, from China to France to India. They had monitored underground tests that vented into the atmosphere. They had tracked Soviet weapons development. They had verified compliance with international treaties. And in all that time, across all those years, the Vela satellites had never once falsely identified a nuclear explosion. Their track record was perfect. Until September 22nd, 1979. Chapter 2. The signal that changed everything. The data came in at 03:53 Coordinated Universal Time. Vela 6911, orbiting high above the Indian Ocean, recorded a light signature that matched every single characteristic of a nuclear detonation. The signal showed what nuclear weapons analysts call a double hump light curve. First flash. The initial detonation, the moment the nuclear reaction begins and releases an enormous burst of light and energy. Brief darkness. A fraction of a second where the explosion's shockwave compresses the surrounding air, momentarily obscuring the fireball. Second flash. The fireball re-emerges, brighter than before, as it expands and the atmosphere becomes transparent again to the intense light. This double flash pattern is the signature of atmospheric nuclear explosions. It's not something you see in lightning strikes, not in meteor impacts, not in any natural phenomenon known to science. It's nuclear. Always nuclear. The light curve recorded by Vela 6911 matched known nuclear tests almost perfectly. The intensity was consistent with a yield between 2 and 3 kilotons, a tactical nuclear weapon, small by Cold War standards but devastating nonetheless. But the satellite data was only the beginning. Within hours, analysts began correlating information from other monitoring systems around the world. United States Navy hydrophones, underwater acoustic sensors designed to detect submarine movements and underwater explosions, had recorded anomalous signals in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean regions around the same time as the flash. The acoustic patterns were consistent with a distant underwater disturbance, possibly an explosion. Weather monitoring stations in Australia detected unusual ionospheric disturbances, disruptions in the electrically charged layers of the upper atmosphere. Nuclear explosions create these disturbances. They're part of the signature. Multiple independent sensors, different technologies, different locations, all pointing to the same conclusion. Something had exploded, something nuclear, and it had happened in one of the most remote regions of Earth, far from prying eyes, far from civilian populations, far from the oversight of international observers. The data was routed immediately to the Pentagon, to the Central Intelligence Agency, to the Department of Energy, to the National Security Council. Within the classified corridors of American intelligence, panic began to spread. Because if this was a nuclear test, if someone had successfully detonated a nuclear weapon in secret, then the entire framework of nuclear non-proliferation had just collapsed. Chapter 3. Immediate panic inside the Pentagon. The initial assessment was blunt. Classified briefings circulated among defense analysts, intelligence officers, and military leadership. The consensus, at least in those first hours and days, was stark. This appeared to be a nuclear detonation. The question wasn't whether something had exploded. The question was who had done it. Analysts began compiling a list of suspects, nations with the capability, the motivation and the secrecy to pull off a clandestine nuclear test in the middle of the ocean. 2 names rose to the top, South Africa and Israel. South Africa in 1979 was an international pariah. The apartheid regime was facing increasing isolation, sanctions and condemnation. But it also had something most nations didn't have: uranium. Vast deposits of uranium ore, the raw material for nuclear weapons, and it had the industrial infrastructure to refine that uranium into weapons-grade material. Throughout the 1970s, South Africa had been quietly developing a nuclear weapons program. Western intelligence agencies knew this. They had satellite photos of the suspected facilities. They had intercepted communications. They had reports from defectors and informants. But South Africa needed to test. You can't build a nuclear arsenal without knowing your weapons actually work. And testing inside South Africa was impossible. Too many satellites, too many international observers, too much scrutiny. A remote ocean test, however, would be different. Isolated, plausibly deniable, especially if conducted at night in the middle of winter in the southern hemisphere, when weather conditions would obscure any visual evidence and disperse radioactive debris before sampling aircraft could arrive. Then there was Israel. Israel had never officially admitted to possessing nuclear weapons. The policy was called nuclear ambiguity, a deliberate strategy of neither confirming nor denying the existence of an Israeli nuclear arsenal. But Western intelligence agencies weren't ambiguous about it. They knew Israel had the bomb. Estimates suggested Israel had developed nuclear weapons as early as the late 1960s, possibly with assistance from France. The reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert was the centerpiece of the program. But like South Africa, Israel faced a problem. You can build weapons in secret. You can develop the infrastructure, refine the materials, assemble the devices. But at some point, if you want a credible deterrent, you need to know they work. And testing inside Israel was unthinkable. Too small, too densely populated, too close to hostile neighbours who would immediately detect and exploit any nuclear test for propaganda and diplomatic purposes. What Israel needed was a partner, a nation with remote territory, a nation with shared interests, a nation also developing nuclear weapons and facing international isolation. South Africa fit perfectly. By the late 1970s, Israel and South Africa had developed close military ties, arms sales, intelligence sharing, joint development programs, and, according to multiple intelligence assessments, nuclear cooperation. A joint Israeli-South African nuclear test in the remote Southern Ocean would serve both nations' interests. Israel would get verification that its weapons worked. South Africa would benefit from Israeli technical expertise. Both could maintain plausible deniability. The location of the Vela flash, somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean or South Atlantic, was consistent with this theory. Remote, international waters, far from major shipping lanes, close enough to South African territory for logistical support, but far enough to maintain deniability. Everything fit. The intelligence community's assessment was clear. The Vela flash was most likely a clandestine nuclear test conducted by South Africa, possibly in cooperation with Israel. But confirming this publicly would create an immediate crisis. It would mean a nation had violated the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It would mean the nuclear non-proliferation regime was failing. It would mean new nations were joining the nuclear club outside the established framework. And it would mean the United States would be forced to take action, impose sanctions, possibly trigger a broader diplomatic crisis at a time when the Carter administration was already struggling with crises in Iran, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, with an energy crisis at home. The political calculation was brutal. Confirming the truth would cause more problems than it would solve. So instead of making a definitive announcement, the White House made a different decision. Order a review, form a panel, re-examine the data, and find a way to make this problem disappear. Chapter 4. The Carter administration intervenes. President Jimmy Carter was briefed on the Vela incident within days of the flash. Years later, after leaving office, Carter would discuss the incident in interviews and in his personal writings. His recollection was telling. He believed, at least initially, that the flash was a nuclear test. The data was compelling. The intelligence assessments were consistent. Everything pointed to a real detonation. But Carter also understood the implications. If the United States confirmed that a nation had conducted a secret nuclear test, it would trigger a cascade of consequences. International treaties would be violated. The United Nations would demand investigations. Sanctions would have to be imposed. Diplomatic relationships would be strained. And in 1979, the Carter administration was already dealing with multiple crises. The Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah. American hostages would soon be seized in Tehran. The Soviet Union was about to invade Afghanistan. The global balance of power was shifting. Adding a nuclear crisis to the mix was politically untenable, so the decision was made. Instead of announcing that a nuclear test had occurred, the administration would form a special scientific panel to review the data and determine if there could be any alternative explanation. The goal wasn't necessarily to find the truth. The goal was to find doubt, to create enough scientific ambiguity that the United States could avoid making a definitive statement, to buy time, space, and diplomatic flexibility. The panel would be led by a man named Jack Ruina, a former Pentagon scientist and arms control expert, someone with credibility in the scientific community and experience navigating the intersection of science and policy. The panel's official mandate was to determine whether the Vela signal could have been caused by something other than a nuclear explosion. And over the following months, that's exactly what they tried to do. Chapter 5. The Ruina Panel. The Ruina Panel began its work in late 1979 and continued into 1980. The task was straightforward on paper: examine all available data and determine the most likely explanation for the Vela flash. But the political pressure was enormous. The panel reviewed the satellite data, the light curves, the sensor readings. They examined the hydroacoustic signals from Navy listening stations. They analysed weather patterns, ionospheric data, and astronomical records, and they began proposing alternative explanations. Could it have been a meteor, a small asteroid entering the atmosphere at just the right angle, with just the right composition, to produce a double flash? Possible. but meteor specialists pointed out that meteors don't produce the specific double hump pattern seen in nuclear explosions, and the probability of a meteor strike occurring at precisely the location and time to mimic a nuclear signature was vanishingly small. Could it have been lightning? A rare atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps a massive superbolt that somehow triggered the sensors? Again, possible in theory, but lightning doesn't create the same spectral signatures as nuclear explosions. The light from lightning has a different colour distribution, a different intensity pattern, a different temporal profile. Could it have been a sensor malfunction? Perhaps Vela 6911 had experienced a technical failure, generating false readings? But the satellite had been functioning perfectly before and after the incident, and other monitoring systems had detected anomalies at the same time. Multiple independent. Sensors don't malfunction simultaneously in ways that all mimic a nuclear explosion. The panel considered and rejected numerous hypotheses, and yet when the final report was released in the summer of 1980, the conclusion was carefully worded. The panel stated that the signal was probably not from a nuclear explosion. Not definitely not. Not conclusively ruled out. Probably not. The report acknowledged that no definitive alternative explanation had been found. It admitted that the signal resembled a nuclear detonation, but it suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions, combined with possible sensor anomalies, could have created a false positive. The conclusion was deliberately vague, designed to create just enough doubt to allow the government to avoid making a firm declaration. And with that report, the official position of the United States government became clear. The Vela incident was not a nuclear test. Case closed. Except the case was far from closed. Chapter 6. The scientists who disagreed. Not everyone accepted the Ruiner panel's conclusion. Richard Garwin, one of the most respected physicists in America, a man who had helped design the hydrogen bomb, publicly disputed the findings. Garwin reviewed the data independently and concluded that the signal strongly supported a nuclear test. He argued that the double flash pattern, the intensity, the duration, all matched known nuclear explosions. He challenged the panel to provide a credible alternative explanation, and when none was offered, he stood by his assessment. Other scientists joined the dissent. They pointed out that the Vela satellites had operated for 16 years without a single false positive, suggesting that this one incident was a sensor error required believing in an extraordinary coincidence. They noted that independent monitoring systems had detected anomalies consistent with a nuclear explosion. The probability that all of these systems would simultaneously malfunction or misinterpret natural phenomena in precisely the same way was statistically absurd. They questioned the political motivations behind the panel's conclusion, suggesting that the vague language was designed to provide diplomatic cover rather than scientific clarity. But the dissent was largely ignored. The mainstream media accepted the government's position. The Vela incident faded from public attention, and the official narrative remained unchanged. It was not a nuclear test. It was something else, something unexplained, but definitely not nuclear. And that's where the story might have ended, buried in classified files and forgotten by history, except the evidence kept surfacing. Chapter 7. The scientists who paid the price. Richard Garwin wasn't just any physicist voicing concerns. He was a legend in the nuclear weapons community, a man who had designed the first hydrogen bomb alongside Edward Teller, a scientific advisor to multiple presidents, a voice that carried weight in the highest levels of government, and after the Vela incident his career trajectory changed. Garwin continued to publicly dispute the Ruiner panel's findings throughout 1980 and into 1981. He gave interviews, he published papers, he testified before congressional committees when given the chance. He argued repeatedly and forcefully that the scientific evidence supported a nuclear test, and that the government's conclusion was politically motivated rather than scientifically sound. And slowly, quietly, he found himself being excluded from certain briefings. Invitations to consult on sensitive projects became less frequent. Security clearances that had been routinely renewed for decades suddenly required additional reviews. Nothing overt, nothing that could be called retaliation. But the message was clear. There were some truths you didn't challenge publicly. Other scientists who had expressed doubts about the official narrative experienced similar treatment. Panel members who had dissented from the majority conclusion, whose names appeared in footnotes of the classified version of the Rowena report, found their future government contracts mysteriously delayed or denied. Academic researchers who published papers questioning the meteor or lightning hypotheses discovered that funding for their work became harder to secure. The mechanism wasn't conspiracy. It was bureaucratic pressure, subtle, deniable, effective. Because in the world of classified science, access is everything, and access is controlled by people who value loyalty to the institution over loyalty to truth. One former Defense Department analyst, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere in the months following the panel's conclusion. "We all knew what the data showed," he said. "We'd all seen nuclear test signatures before. This was nuclear. But the decision had been made at the highest levels that we weren't going to confirm it. And if you wanted to keep working on nuclear issues, if you wanted to keep your clearance, you learned not to push too hard." The chilling effect was real. Scientists stopped asking questions, researchers moved on to other topics, and the official narrative solidified, not because it was scientifically sound, but because challenging it had become professionally dangerous. Chapter 8. The search that was designed to fail. The story of the search for radioactive debris is even more troubling when you examine the details. Standard protocol for suspected nuclear events was well established by 1979. Detection, assessment, immediate deployment of sampling aircraft to collect air samples and particulate matter. Speed was essential. Radioactive debris from atmospheric nuclear tests disperses rapidly. Within hours, it can spread over hundreds of miles. Within days, it can circle the globe at high altitudes. Within weeks, it becomes so diluted that detection is nearly impossible. The Air Force had specialised aircraft ready for exactly this mission. Blue C-135 Constant Phoenix planes, flying laboratories equipped with filters and sensors designed to collect and analyse airborne radioactive particles. These planes were deployed regularly during the Cold War to sample Soviet and Chinese nuclear tests. They knew the protocols, they knew the urgency. So when did they deploy after the Vela flash? The first sampling missions didn't launch until nearly a week after the event. A week! By that time, any debris would have been scattered across vast areas of the southern hemisphere, diluted by weather systems mixed with natural background radiation. And the search area was enormous. The Vela satellite could pinpoint the flash to within hundreds of miles, but that still left a search zone covering hundreds of thousands of square miles of empty ocean. The sampling flights conducted a handful of passes over the suspected region. They collected air samples at various altitudes. They analysed filters for radioactive particles, and officially, they found nothing definitive. But here's where the story gets strange. Flight logs from those missions, partially declassified years later, show unusual patterns. Some flights were routed through areas that seemed inconsistent with the satellite data. They sampled regions north of the suspected detonation site, when prevailing winds would have carried debris southeast. Flight durations were shorter than standard protocols required. Missions that should have lasted 8 to 10 hours were completed in 4 to 6. And most tellingly, some of the collected samples were never fully analysed. A former Air Force technician who worked on the sampling program spoke to researchers in the 2000s, decades after the event. He described receiving samples from the southern Indian Ocean missions and being told to conduct only preliminary analysis. Normally, we'd run every test available, he explained. Full spectrum analysis, isotope identification, the works. With these samples, we were told to do a basic check and move on. It was unusual. It felt like they didn't want us to find anything. Was the search deliberately sabotaged? Or was it simply a case of bureaucratic delay and inadequate resources? The answer depends on how much you trust official explanations, but the fact remains. The search for radioactive debris was conducted in a manner that virtually guaranteed nothing would be found, even if debris existed. Chapter 9. The document that changed everything. Of all the declassified materials related to the Vela Incident, one document stands out. It was released in 2006, more than 25 years after the event, as part of a batch of previously classified CIA intelligence assessments. The document is dated October 15th, 1979, just 3 weeks after the flash. The title, Assessment of Anomalous Signal Detected by Vela Satellite on September 22, 1979. The assessment is 12 pages long. Most of it is technical analysis, reviewing the sensor data, comparing the signal to known nuclear tests, discussing the double flash pattern. But on page 9, there's a section titled Most Likely Explanation, and the language is stark. This agency assesses with high confidence that the signal detected by Vela 6911 on September 22, 1979, was caused by a nuclear explosion. The optical signature, intensity profile, and temporal characteristics are consistent with an atmospheric or near-surface detonation in the 2 to 4 kiloton range. It continues, we assess with moderate confidence that the test was conducted by the Republic of South Africa, possibly in cooperation with Israel. Both nations have motives to conduct clandestine testing, access to remote maritime regions suitable for such a test, and established patterns of military cooperation that would facilitate joint operations. The document then discusses the political implications. Public confirmation of this assessment would likely require the United States to impose sanctions on South Africa and potentially strain relations with Israel. Given current geopolitical priorities and the lack of direct evidence that could withstand international scrutiny, this agency recommends that definitive attribution be avoided pending further investigation. In other words, the CIA knew. They assessed it was nuclear. They identified the likely perpetrators, and they recommended keeping it quiet for political reasons. The document was classified top secret at the time. It was not shared with the public. It was not given to the press. It was not acknowledged in official statements. Instead, the Ruiner panel was convened, and a more politically palatable conclusion was reached. When this document was finally declassified in 2006, it received minimal media attention. A few articles in specialised publications, a brief mention in some defence journals. But it fundamentally undermines the official narrative, because it proves that the ambiguity was manufactured. The government knew what happened. They just chose not to tell anyone. Chapter 10. The naval officer who heard the bomb in 2012, a retired United States Navy officer, came forward with his own account of the Vela incident. His name was Commander James Howell, retired. He had served as a sonar technician aboard a Navy surveillance ship operating in the southern Atlantic in late 1979. Howell's ship was equipped with advanced underwater listening equipment, part of the Navy's sound surveillance system, a network of hydrophones designed to track Soviet submarines. On the night of September 22, 1979, Howell was on duty when the hydrophones detected an unusual signal. In an interview with a documentary filmmaker, Howell described what he heard. It wasn't like anything we'd encountered before. We tracked submarine launches, underwater explosions from depth charges during exercises, all kinds of acoustic phenomena. This was different. It was a single, massive pressure wave. Sharp onset. Long decay. The acoustic signature was consistent with a large explosion, but not underwater. It was more like something detonating just above the surface or in the lower atmosphere, creating a shock wave that propagated through the water. Howell and his team logged the signal and reported it through normal channels. Within hours, they received orders to seal their logs and not discuss the detection with anyone outside their chain of command. We all knew what that meant, Howell said. Something big had happened, and someone high up didn't want it talked about. Weeks later, Howell's commander was quietly reassigned. The sonar logs from that night were collected and removed from the ship. The crew was reminded of their security obligations and told that discussing the incident could result in charges under the Espionage Act. Howell kept quiet for more than 30 years. He followed orders, he maintained his clearance, he served honourably, and retired with full benefits. But after reading about the declassified CIA documents and the ongoing debate about the Vela incident, he decided to speak. "I'm in my 70s now," he said. "I don't care about clearances anymore. I don't care about protecting bureaucratic secrets. I know what I heard. We detected an explosion, and the government knew about it and covered it up. People deserve to know the truth." Howell's account corroborates the satellite data, the CIA assessment, and the conclusions of scientists like Richard Garwin. Multiple independent systems detected the same event, and all of them were dismissed, classified, or explained away. Chapter 11. The Israel Connection. In the years and decades following the Vela Incident, declassified documents began to paint a more detailed picture of what intelligence agencies actually believed. Internal CIA memos from the period referred to the event as the South Atlantic Flash, treating it not as a mystery, but as a known event with unclear attribution. One memo, declassified in the 1990s, stated plainly that the flash was probably a nuclear test, and that the most likely suspects were South Africa and Israel, possibly in cooperation. Other documents revealed that American intelligence had been tracking Israeli-South African military cooperation closely throughout the 1970s. Arms shipments, technology transfers, joint exercises, and nuclear collaboration. In 1977, 2 years before the Vela Incident, Soviet satellites had photographed what appeared to be preparations for a nuclear test in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. International pressure, led by the United States, forced South Africa to abandon the test. But the program didn't end. It went underground, or rather, it went out to sea. Israel had compelling reasons to want a nuclear test. Deterrence against hostile neighbours required credibility, and credibility required proof that your weapons actually worked. But Israel also needed deniability. Open testing would destroy the policy of nuclear ambiguity and trigger international condemnation, possibly military retaliation from Arab states. A joint test with South Africa in international waters solved both problems. Israel would get confirmation. South Africa would advance its program. Both could deny responsibility. The logistics would have been complex but manageable. A small nuclear device could be placed on a ship or barge, towed to a remote location, and detonated underwater or in the air just above the surface. Timing the test to coincide with poor weather in the southern hemisphere winter would help disperse radioactive debris and reduce the chances of detection by sampling aircraft. And conducting the test at night, when most surveillance assets were less effective, provided an additional layer of concealment. The Vela flash occurred in the middle of the southern hemisphere winter, at night, in a remote region of the ocean where South African ships had legitimate reasons to operate. Every piece of circumstantial evidence pointed to a planned, executed, and successfully concealed nuclear test. But officially, nothing had happened. Chapter 12. The missing radiation. One of the key arguments used to dispute the nuclear test hypothesis was the lack of detected radioactive fallout. If a nuclear weapon had detonated, the argument went, radioactive debris would have been dispersed into the atmosphere and eventually detected by sampling aircraft or ground-based monitoring stations. But no radioactive debris was officially confirmed. This absence of evidence became evidence of absence in the official narrative. Except the story of the search for radioactive debris is itself suspicious. Sampling missions were delayed. By the time aircraft were dispatched to the region, several days had passed. Weather patterns had shifted. Any debris would have been dispersed over vast areas of the ocean. The search area was enormous, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles. The sampling flights were limited in number and duration. The likelihood of finding dispersed radioactive particles in such a vast area days after the event was minimal. And then there's the question of what was actually found and what was reported. Some researchers have pointed to thyroid abnormalities detected in sheep in parts of Australia in the months following the Vela incident. Thyroid problems in livestock are a known indicator of exposure to radioactive iodine, a common byproduct of nuclear fission. Australian scientists at the time noted the anomalies but couldn't definitively link them to the Vela flash. The data was inconclusive, complicated by other possible sources of contamination, but the fact remains, The absence of detected radiation doesn't prove there was no nuclear explosion. It proves that sampling efforts were delayed, limited, and possibly insufficient to detect what was there. Conspiracy theorists go further. They argue that detection was avoided intentionally, that the delays were deliberate, that evidence was found but suppressed to maintain diplomatic stability. They point to the geopolitical stakes. Confirming the test would have forced the United States to impose sanctions on South Africa, a key anti-communist ally in southern Africa during the Cold War. It would have strained relationships with Israel, America's closest ally in the Middle East. The cost of confirmation was too high. So the evidence, if it existed, was buried, and the official narrative remained intact. Chapter 13. Declassified documents complete the picture. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as Cold War documents were gradually declassified, the official story of the Vela Incident began to crack. Internal government memos revealed deep divisions within the intelligence community about the nature of the event. Some agencies believed it was definitely a nuclear test. Others were more cautious, but acknowledged the evidence was compelling. Almost no one genuinely believed the alternative explanations proposed by the Ruina panel. One particularly revealing document was a CIA intelligence assessment from 1980. The report, declassified decades later, stated that the agency had high confidence the flash was a nuclear explosion, and moderate confidence that it was conducted by South Africa, possibly with Israeli involvement. The same document noted that the Ruina panel's conclusion was inconsistent with the technical data and appeared to be influenced by policy considerations rather than scientific analysis. In other words, the CIA believed the panel's conclusion was politically motivated. Another document from the Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that the event had all the characteristics of a nuclear test, and that no plausible alternative explanation exists. These assessments were classified for years. The public was told one story. The intelligence community believed another. But even with these revelations, no official reversal ever came. The government never issued a corrected statement. No press conference was held to admit the truth. No formal acknowledgement was made. The official position remained unchanged. The Vela flash was probably not a nuclear test, and in the absence of definitive proof, the ambiguity persists. Chapter 14. The modern implications. The Vela incident isn't just a Cold War mystery, it's a precedent, and that precedent echoes through every nuclear crisis we face today. When North Korea conducts underground nuclear tests and the international community debates the evidence, the Vela incident hangs in the background. Because if a nation could conduct a nuclear test in 1979 and avoid consequences through official ambiguity, why couldn't North Korea do the same? North Korea has conducted 6 acknowledged nuclear tests between 2006 and 2017. Each time, seismic sensors detect the underground explosions. Each time, the international community condemns the tests. Each time, sanctions are imposed. But what about tests that aren't acknowledged? What about smaller, more carefully concealed detonations that could be attributed to earthquakes or mining explosions? The Vela incident proved that with enough political will, evidence can be dismissed, findings can be disputed, and the truth can be buried under layers of official doubt. When Western intelligence agencies assess Iran's nuclear program, they're operating in the shadow of the Vela incident. Iran insists its nuclear program is peaceful. International inspectors monitor declared facilities. Intelligence agencies watch for signs of weaponization. But everyone involved knows that detection systems can be evaded, that tests can be concealed, that even when evidence exists, political considerations can prevent acknowledgement. The precedent set in 1979 taught nations around the world a valuable lesson. If you're careful enough, if you choose your location wisely, if you have the right political cover, you can test a nuclear weapon and get away with it. And that lesson has implications for the future of nuclear non-proliferation. How do you enforce treaties when evidence can be disputed? How do you maintain deterrence when tests can be denied? How do you prevent proliferation when the consequences of detection are negotiable? The Vela incident didn't just change history, It changed the rules of the game, and we're still playing by those rules today. In recent years, there have been mysterious seismic events that some analysts believe could be covert nuclear tests. Small seismic disturbances in remote regions, acoustic anomalies detected by monitoring stations, radiation measurements that spike and then disappear. Each time, the official explanation is natural phenomena, earthquakes, mining activity, instrument errors, and each time skeptics point back to the Vela Incident. Because if the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built could record a nuclear explosion and have that explosion officially dismissed, what's to stop it from happening again? The technology has improved since 1979. The monitoring networks are more extensive, the sensors are more sensitive, but the political calculations remain the same. Sometimes confirming the truth causes more problems than maintaining ambiguity, and that's the legacy of the Vela Incident. Not just what happened on September 22nd, 1979, but what it taught the world about the gap between evidence and acknowledgement, between detection and confirmation, between what we know and what we're willing to admit. Chapter 15. Why the Truth Still Matters. More than 4 decades have passed since the Vela Incident. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union collapsed. South Africa abandoned its nuclear weapons program in the early 1990s and dismantled its arsenal. Israel still maintains its policy of nuclear ambiguity, but is widely acknowledged to possess a substantial nuclear arsenal. So why does the Vela Incident still matter? Because the implications extend far beyond that single flash in 1979. If the Vela Incident was a nuclear test, it means a nation successfully violated international law and got away with it. It means the framework of nuclear non-proliferation, the treaties and monitoring systems designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, failed at a critical moment. It means the United States government knowingly covered up that failure for political reasons, prioritising diplomatic convenience over transparency and accountability. And it means that other nations, watching and learning from this precedent, understood that clandestine nuclear tests are possible, that with enough planning, enough secrecy, enough political cover, you can test a nuclear weapon and avoid consequences. But if the Vela Incident was not a nuclear test, if the government's explanation is accurate, then the implications are equally troubling. It means the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built failed. Once, and only once. It means that a sensor array that had operated flawlessly for 16 years, that had never produced a false positive, somehow malfunctioned in a way that perfectly mimicked a nuclear explosion. It means that multiple independent monitoring systems simultaneously detected anomalies that collectively suggested a nuclear event, but all were wrong. It means that scientists still cannot definitively explain what happened. Either answer is disturbing. Either we live in a world where nuclear tests can be hidden and covered up, or we live in a world where our best monitoring systems can fail in catastrophic and unexplained ways. Both possibilities undermine confidence in the global non-proliferation regime. Both suggest that the systems designed to keep us safe from nuclear threats are more fragile than we'd like to believe. Chapter 16. The Witnesses Who Disappeared. Over the years, researchers and journalists have tried to track down the people who were directly involved in the Vela Incident response, the satellite operators who first received the data, the intelligence analysts who wrote the initial assessments, the Navy personnel who detected the acoustic signals, the Air Force pilots who flew the sampling missions. Many are deceased, others retired and disappeared from public view. Some signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from speaking, but a few have come forward, usually near the end of their lives, when the weight of the secret becomes heavier than the consequences of speaking. In 2015, a former satellite data analyst named Patricia Hendricks gave an interview to a researcher investigating the Vela Incident. Hendricks had worked at the Air Force Technical Application Center in the early 1980s, reviewing satellite data and writing assessments for military leadership. She had access to the classified files on the Vela flash. The original reports were definitive, she said. There was no ambiguity in the technical analysis. It was a nuclear detonation. The only debate was about attribution, who had done it, and whether we could prove it. Hendricks described the pressure analysts felt to soften their conclusions. We were told to find alternative explanations, to emphasise uncertainty, to avoid definitive statements. It wasn't about the science anymore. It was about what the White House wanted to hear. When asked if she believed the official conclusion, Hendricks laughed. No one who actually looked at the data believed it was anything other than nuclear. But we had careers to protect, families to support. You learn to write reports that say what you're supposed to say, even when you know it's not true. Another witness, a former CIA officer named Thomas Reynolds, spoke to journalists in 2018, shortly before his death from cancer. Reynolds had been stationed in the Middle East in the late 1970s, monitoring Israeli military activities. We knew about the cooperation with South Africa, he said. We had reports of Israeli technicians working at South African facilities. We intercepted communications discussing joint projects. When the Vela flash happened, everyone in the intelligence community immediately suspected Israel and South Africa. Reynolds described the decision-making process in the weeks after the incident. The question wasn't whether it was nuclear. The question was whether we could afford to confirm it. Israel was our most important ally in the region. South Africa was a key anti-communist partner in Africa. Confirming the test would have required sanctions, diplomatic consequences, maybe even criminal investigations. The decision was made to classify the evidence, bury the conclusions and move on. It was Cold War realism. Sometimes the truth is less important than stability. These witnesses, speaking decades after the event, paint a consistent picture. The truth was known, the evidence was clear, and the decision was made to conceal it. Final chapter. The flash that won't go away. The Vela Incident occupies a unique space in the landscape of Cold War mysteries. It's not a UFO sighting, easily dismissed as misidentification or imagination. It's not a conspiracy theory built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. It's a documented event, recorded by multiple sophisticated sensors, analysed by some of the best scientists in the world, discussed in classified government documents, and yet it remains unresolved. No natural explanation satisfies the physicists who have studied the data. Meteor impacts don't create double flashes. Lightning doesn't produce the right spectral signature. Sensor malfunctions don't explain corroborating data from independent systems. No government has ever admitted responsibility. South Africa dismantled its nuclear program without confirming or denying the test. Israel maintains its policy of nuclear ambiguity. The United States sticks to its vague assessment that the event was probably not nuclear. No new evidence has emerged to close the case definitively. The radioactive debris, if it existed, is long gone. The ships or platforms that might have been used are likely destroyed or repurposed. The personnel involved are aging or deceased. The Vela Incident exists in a perfect grey zone of uncertainty. Too real to dismiss as fantasy, too dangerous to confirm as fact. And that ambiguity, that deliberate cultivation of doubt may be exactly the point. Because some truths are too inconvenient to acknowledge. Some facts are too disruptive to admit. Some flashes of light are too bright to look at directly. On September 22nd, 1979, at 3:53 in the morning Coordinated Universal Time, something happened over the southern Indian Ocean. A satellite saw it. Sensors recorded it. Analysts studied it. And the world was told it didn't matter. But it did matter. It still matters. Because that flash, that brief moment of light captured by Vela 6911, represents something fundamental about the nuclear age. The gap between what we know and what we're told. The space between truth and politics. The moment when evidence meets denial, and denial wins. The Vela Incident is a reminder that not all mysteries are solved. Not all questions are answered. And not all lights in the darkness are meant to be explained. Some are meant to be forgotten. But the flash over the Indian Ocean refuses to go away. It remains in the historical record, in declassified files, in scientific journals, in the memories of those who studied the data and knew what they had seen. It remains as a testament to the fragility of truth in a world where power and secrecy often matter more than facts. And it remains as a question that will never be fully answered. What happened on September 22nd, 1979? Was it a nuclear test? Or was it something else? The answer depends on who you ask, and who you choose to believe. But the light that flashed over the ocean that night was real. The sensors that detected it were real. The scientists who analysed it were real. And the cover-up, whether motivated by politics or prudence, was real too. The Vela Incident happened. What it means, what it represents, what it tells us about nuclear weapons and government secrecy, and the nature of truth in the modern world is still being debated. And perhaps that's exactly how it was meant to be. A flash of light, a moment of truth, and then darkness. Questions without answers, evidence without confirmation, a mystery that exists in the space between what we saw and what we were allowed to know. The flash over the Indian Ocean, the nuclear explosion that officially never happened, and the reminder that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're never told. But here's what we do know for certain. On September 22nd, 1979, the most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built recorded an event consistent with a nuclear explosion. Multiple independent sensors corroborated the detection. The United States intelligence community assessed with high confidence that the event was nuclear. Scientists who analysed the data concluded it matched known nuclear test signatures, and the official conclusion was probably not a nuclear explosion. That gap, that chasm between evidence and acknowledgement, tells us everything we need to know about how governments handle inconvenient truths. It tells us that detection doesn't guarantee disclosure, that evidence doesn't guarantee acknowledgement, that sometimes the machinery of power decides that ambiguity serves the national interest better than truth. The Vela Incident is a case study in institutional denial, not the denial of conspiracy theorists who reject all official narratives, but the denial of institutions that shape official narratives to serve political ends. The scientists knew, the analysts knew, the intelligence officers knew, but the public was told something different. And that difference matters, because we live in a world where nuclear weapons exist, where nations pursue them in secret, where tests can be concealed and evidence can be disputed. The Vela Incident is a warning. Not about what happened in 1979, but about what continues to happen every time evidence is classified, conclusions are softened, and inconvenient truths are buried beneath layers of official ambiguity. The flash over the southern Indian Ocean was real. What it means for nuclear non-proliferation, for international security, for the reliability of our detection systems, remains unresolved. And perhaps that's the most frightening thing of all. Not the explosion itself, but the fact that we still don't know, officially, whether it even happened. The Eye of Atlantis, Secrets Beneath the Sahara. Before we begin, I want to thank Alwyn, eventually, for suggesting this incredible topic. Your curiosity drives us to explore the mysteries that history has buried, and today's story is one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human civilization. Imagine standing at the edge of infinity. The The sun beats down on endless dunes that stretch to every horizon, waves of sand frozen in time. You're in one of the most remote places on Earth, the Western Sahara of Mauritania, where few humans venture and even fewer return unchanged. But you're not here for the desert. You're here for something that should not exist. Something so massive, so perfectly formed, that it can only truly be seen from space itself. From orbit, astronauts have called it the most remarkable feature in Africa. Geologists call it an anomaly. Ancient theorists call it proof. The locals who live in its shadow call it cursed. But to those who dare to connect the dots between myth and reality, it has another name entirely. They call it Atlantis. This is the story of the Rishi structure, a formation so immense and so geometrically precise that it defies every explanation we have been given. This is the story of how a philosopher's legend became an archaeological obsession, how satellite imagery revealed what ground expeditions could not find, and how the greatest mystery of the ancient world might be hiding not beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, but beneath an ocean of sand. What you're about to hear will make you question the timeline of human history. It will make you wonder what else has been buried, redacted, or simply forgotten. Because in the heart of the Sahara lies a perfect circle, and within that circle may lie the answer to humanity's oldest question. Where did we really come from? The discovery. The year was 1965. Astronaut James McDivitt was aboard Gemini 4, orbiting Earth at speeds that would make the mind reel. He was supposed to be focused on his mission parameters, on the technical readings and trajectory calculations that kept him alive in the vacuum of space. But something caught his eye through the small window of his capsule, something down on the surface of northwest Africa that made him reach for the camera. What he photographed that day would haunt researchers for generations. It appeared as a perfect bullseye in the desert, concentric circles of rock radiating outward from a central point with mathematical precision. The formation was enormous, stretching approximately 25 miles across, visible only because of the altitude and angle of his spacecraft. From the ground it would be impossible to see. From orbit it was unmistakable. The photograph was filed with thousands of others from the Gemini program, labelled and archived. But it kept appearing in subsequent missions. Apollo astronauts saw it. Shuttle crews saw it. Every single orbital mission that passed over Mauritania captured the same haunting image. A perfect eye staring up from the Sahara. The scientific community took notice. In the early 1970s, the Geological Survey of Mauritania conducted the first detailed mapping expedition to the site. What they found both explained and deepened the mystery. The formation consisted of 3 distinct concentric rings, each composed of different rock types. The outer ring was limestone, ancient and weathered. The middle ring was quartzite, harder and more resistant to erosion. The inner ring contained rhyolite, a volcanic rock that suggested deep geological forces at work. They named it the Rishi structure, after the small desert town of Ouadan that sat near its perimeter. The official explanation was presented with confidence. This was an eroded geological dome, created by the uplift of rock layers over hundreds of millions of years, then slowly worn down by wind and rare desert rains into this circular pattern. Case closed, they said. Natural formation. Nothing more to see. But there was a problem with that explanation. A problem that would not go away no matter how many times the scientific establishment repeated their conclusions. The symmetry was too perfect. The spacing between rings was too regular. The ratios were too precise. Natural erosion is chaotic, random, asymmetrical. Rivers carve irregular paths. Wind creates jagged formations. Time does not draw with a compass. Yet here, in the middle of nowhere, was a structure that looked exactly as if someone had used a compass the size of a mountain range to draw 3 perfect circles in the earth itself. The measurements were even more troubling. When surveyed with precision instruments, The rings showed spacing ratios that appeared intentional. The distances between them followed patterns that seemed almost mathematical, and the entire structure was oriented with geographic precision that natural forces do not typically produce. Geologists published papers explaining the dome theory. They showed diagrams of how uplifted rock could erode into circular patterns under specific conditions. They pointed to other geological domes around the world as comparison. But none of those other formations looked anything like the Richat structure. None had the perfect symmetry. None had the precise spacing. None looked like they had been designed. And then someone remembered Plato. Plato's blueprint. In 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote 2 dialogues that would become the most famous unsolved mystery in human history. In Timaeus and Critias, he described a legendary island civilization called Atlantis, a place of advanced technology and culture that was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophic floods. For over 2,000 years, explorers and historians searched for Atlantis. They looked in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in dozens of locations around the globe. Every generation had a new theory, a new location, a new explanation for where this legendary civilization might have existed. But every theory had the same problem. None of them matched Plato's actual description, because Plato had not been vague. He had been remarkably specific. He described Atlantis as a circular island consisting of concentric rings of land and water. He gave precise measurements for these rings. He described mountains to the north and open plains to the south. He mentioned that the civilization had access to a rare red, black and white stone. He explained that the city was positioned near a coastal plain that opened to the sea. Historians had always assumed these details were fictional embellishments, the kind of creative additions that storytellers make to give their tales authenticity. After all, Plato was writing about events that supposedly occurred over 9,000 years before his time. How could he possibly know such specific details? But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, independent researchers began comparing Plato's descriptions to the Richat structure. And what they found was extraordinary. Plato had described the outer ring of Atlantis as being approximately 127 stadia in diameter. A stadia was an ancient Greek unit of measurement roughly equivalent to 185 meters. When you convert Plato's measurements to modern units, the outer ring of Atlantis should be approximately 23.5 kilometers across. The outer ring of the Richat structure measures approximately 23 kilometers in diameter. Plato described the spacing between the rings in specific ratios. The second ring was supposed to be smaller by a precise proportion, and the inner ring smaller still. When researchers measured the Richat structure, the ratios matched within margins that seemed impossible to attribute to coincidence. Plato mentioned that Atlantis had mountains to the north. The Richat structure sits at the base of a highland region to its north. Plato said the civilization faced south toward the sea. In ancient times, before the Sahara became desert, a vast network of rivers and lakes extended south from the Richat region toward what would have been a much larger ancient shoreline. Plato described 3 types of stone used in Atlantean construction: red, black, and white. The Richat structure contains red rhyolite, black volcanic breccia, and white limestone, all present in the geological layers of the site. One by one, the correspondences stacked up. Every detail that Plato had provided matched the Richat structure in ways that no other proposed location for Atlantis had ever matched. It was as if Plato had been describing this exact place, this exact formation, with a precision that should have been impossible for someone writing 2,000 years before satellite photography. The implications were staggering. If Plato had been accurate about the physical description, could he have been accurate about the rest? Could there truly have been an advanced civilization at the Richat structure, a civilization that existed before the desert consumed it? To answer that question, researchers had to answer another one first. Could the Sahara have ever supported such a civilization at all? the Green Sahara. When you picture the Sahara Desert today, you imagine the largest hot desert on Earth, a realm of endless dunes and scorching heat where nothing can survive. But the Sahara has not always been a desert, and the proof of that lies written in the rocks, the fossils, and the satellite images that reveal what the sand has tried to hide. Between approximately 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Climate scientists call this period the African humid period, a time when the Earth's axial tilt and orbital patterns created different weather systems across North Africa. Instead of the bone-dry wasteland we know today, the region was filled with rivers, lakes, forests, and grasslands. Satellite studies conducted by NASA and the University of Arizona using synthetic aperture radar have revealed vast networks of ancient riverbeds beneath the sand. These were not small streams, but major river systems comparable to the Nile, flowing from the interior highlands toward ancient lake basins. One of these river networks passed directly through the region where the Risha structure sits. The fossil record confirms what the radar images suggest. Archaeologists and paleontologists have discovered bones of crocodiles, elephants, hippos and giraffes scattered throughout the Sahara, including in areas very close to the Riche structure. These are not desert animals. They're creatures that require abundant water and vegetation. Their presence proves that the Sahara once sustained rich ecosystems. Rock art found in caves throughout Mauritania and the broader Sahara shows ancient peoples hunting and herding in landscapes filled with wildlife and water. These paintings, some dating back over 10,000 years, depict scenes that would be unimaginable in the current desert. Cattle grazing, people swimming, lush vegetation everywhere. Local Berber and Tuareg oral traditions contain stories passed down through countless generations about cities that once existed in regions now covered by sand. They speak of a time when their ancestors lived in places of great abundance, before the rains failed and the desert consumed everything. They describe ruins beneath the dunes, places where the sand sometimes shifts to reveal ancient walls and forgotten structures. For decades, Western academics dismissed these stories as mythology, the kind of exaggerated tales that every culture tells about a golden age in the distant past. But as satellite technology improved and as archaeological evidence accumulated, researchers began to realise these oral traditions might contain fragments of actual historical memory. If the Sahara was green and fertile during the African humid period, if it supported complex ecosystems and human populations, then a major civilization could have existed there, and if such a civilization had been centred at the Risha structure during that verdant age, it would have had access to everything it needed: water from rivers and lakes, stone from the geological formation itself, a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, and a location that would have been near ancient coastlines or major waterways. But then something happened. Around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifted. The rain stopped. The rivers dried up. The lakes evaporated. The Green Sahara died, and the desert we know today was born. Any civilization that had existed in the interior Sahara would have faced a catastrophic collapse. Not from floods washing their cities into the sea, as Plato had described, but from the opposite, from water disappearing entirely, from fertile lands becoming barren, from the life-giving rivers turning to dust. Could Plato's story of Atlantis being destroyed by water have been a garbled version of the truth? Could the ancient tale have been about a civilization that died not because water came, but because water left? Could the flood that destroyed Atlantis have been a flood of sand instead? The evidence beneath the surface. When you look at satellite imagery of the Rishi structure with fresh eyes, with the possibility that it might be more than just geology, patterns begin to emerge that the official explanations cannot quite account for. The circular ridges that form the famous rings are not uniform in their erosion. In several places they show what appear to be breaches or gaps at regular intervals, as if something other than random weathering created passages through them. These gaps align with what would be expected if the rings had once been reinforced walls with deliberate entry points. Radial patterns extend outward from the inner rings like spokes on a wheel. Erosion alone rarely creates such geometric regularity. But if the ancient inhabitants had built causeways or roads radiating from a central administrative area outward to the peripheral zones, this is exactly the pattern we might expect to find after thousands of years of degradation. The most intriguing evidence comes from analysis of the rock itself. Samples taken from the outer ring areas contain traces of petrified marine organisms, shells and fossilised remnants of sea life that confirm this region was once under or adjacent to water. While this supports the Green Sahara theory, it also raises questions about what else might be preserved in those stone layers. Independent exploration teams who have visited the site report finding tool fragments and stone artefacts in the wadis and depressions around the structure. Some of these artefacts have been carbon dated to over 10,000 years ago, placing them squarely within the time frame when Atlantis was supposed to have existed according to Plato's chronology. Critics immediately point out that finding ancient stone tools in the Sahara is not unusual. Humans have lived in North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, and stone tools are common throughout the region. These artefacts, they argue, have nothing to do with the Risha structure specifically, and certainly do not prove the existence of an advanced civilization. But proponents counter that the consistency and concentration of findings around the Risha area suggest something more than random hunter-gatherer presence. They point to the types of tools discovered, some of which show sophisticated manufacturing techniques. They note the presence of what appear to be worked stones too large to be simple tools, blocks that might have been part of construction projects. The debate intensifies when discussing what lies beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar studies conducted by independent researchers have detected unusual subsurface anomalies within the Rishat structure. Dense strata with geometric patterns, possible void spaces that could indicate chambers or tunnels, symmetrical underground formations that do not fit standard geological models. These findings have not been peer-reviewed or officially published, which mainstream scientists cite as proof of their unreliability. But the researchers who conducted these studies claim they have been unable to get their work published, precisely because it challenges accepted theories. They describe a pattern of journals rejecting their papers without proper review, of academic conferences declining their presentations, of institutional barriers that prevent serious examination of non-mainstream theories about the site. Every piece of evidence that might support the Atlantis theory is met with skepticism and alternative explanations. Every anomaly is dismissed as misinterpretation or equipment error. Every correspondence between the Rishat structure and Plato's description is labelled coincidence, and yet the evidence keeps accumulating. The patterns keep appearing. The questions keep demanding answers that the official explanations cannot quite provide. Which brings us to perhaps the most damning evidence of all, the evidence that someone does not want this site investigated too closely. The Wall of Silence. If the Riche structure is just an eroded geological dome with no archaeological significance, then researching it should be straightforward. Submit a proposal, get a permit, conduct excavations, publish findings. This is how archaeology works at sites around the world. But the Rishat structure is different. Multiple research teams have applied for permits to conduct archaeological excavations within the formation. They have submitted detailed proposals outlining non-invasive survey methods, careful excavation protocols, and collaborative frameworks with local authorities. These applications have been denied repeatedly by Mauritanian government officials, often without clear explanation. The official reasons given vary. Sometimes the authorities cite heritage protection concerns, arguing that the site must be preserved from potential damage. Sometimes they mention environmental sensitivity, claiming that research activity might disrupt the desert ecosystem. Sometimes they simply say the area is closed to archaeological investigation, without providing any justification at all. UNESCO has listed the Risha structure in its World Heritage Tentative List. acknowledging the site's potential significance. But this listing has not led to increased access for researchers. Instead, the area remains classified as environmentally sensitive with strict limitations on who can work there and what methods they can employ. Researchers who have tried to work in the region describe a pattern of obstruction. Local officials who initially express interest in supporting expeditions suddenly become unreachable. Equipment shipments get held up in customs indefinitely. Required permissions get delayed month after month until research seasons pass and funding windows close. It is never an outright refusal, just an endless series of bureaucratic tangles that make serious investigation effectively impossible. Some Western academics who have expressed interest in Saharan archaeology related to the Risha structure report similar obstacles from their own institutions. Grant proposals get rejected with vague criticisms about methodological concerns. Department heads discourage junior researchers from pursuing these topics, warning that it could harm their careers. Peer reviewers block papers from publication, not because of flawed data, but because of controversial implications. One researcher, speaking anonymously to avoid professional repercussions, described the situation bluntly. When your findings challenge established timelines of civilization, the work simply stops receiving support. They do not say you are wrong. They do not engage with your evidence. They just make it impossible for you to continue. The phrase they use is methodological inconsistency, but everyone knows what it really means. Stop digging. This pattern of obstruction extends even to remote sensing data. Several researchers report that high-resolution satellite imagery they had been using for analysis suddenly became restricted or degraded in quality. Digital elevation maps that showed detailed topography of the Risha structure mysteriously disappeared from open archives. Ground-penetrating radar data that had been collected vanished from institutional databases. When questioned about these missing data sets, authorities offer technical explanations: routine data management, updated privacy protocols, licensing restrictions. But the consistency of the pattern is hard to ignore. Data that might support non-mainstream theories about the site becomes unavailable, while data that supports conventional geological explanations remains readily accessible. The silence extends to the media as well. Major documentaries about ancient mysteries and lost civilizations routinely cover the Atlantis legend, but they rarely spend significant time on the Risha structure despite its remarkable correspondences with Plato's description. When it is mentioned, it is usually dismissed quickly with the standard geological explanation, before moving on to more sensational but less evidentially supported locations. Why would so many institutional barriers exist around a site that is supposedly just an eroded rock formation? If there is nothing there, why prevent serious investigation? If the geological explanation is correct, why not allow research that would conclusively prove it and put the Atlantis theories to rest? The refusal to allow thorough investigation becomes its own form of evidence. The silence screams louder than any artifact could. The global pattern. The story of the Risha structure does not exist in isolation. Around the world, researchers have identified other sites with striking similarities: massive stone constructions of uncertain age, precisely aligned with astronomical or geographic markers, built with techniques that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. On the Mediterranean island of Malta, prehistoric temples display architectural sophistication that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. These structures feature precisely cut megalithic blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, fitted together with remarkable precision. Carbon dating places some of these temples over 5,000 years old, making them older than the Egyptian pyramids and contemporary with the Green Sahara period. In Bolivia, the site of Pumapunku contains stone blocks with perfectly smooth surfaces and complex geometric cuts that would challenge modern manufacturing. The blocks show evidence of advanced stoneworking techniques, possibly even machine precision. The ruins include megalithic platforms and structures arranged in geometric patterns. Mainstream dating places the site at around 1500 years old, but some researchers argue the stonework could be much more ancient, citing evidence of weathering patterns and astronomical alignments. In the Azores, underwater formations off the coast have been identified by some researchers as possibly artificial structures, though this remains highly controversial. Sonar imaging has revealed what appear to be rectangular formations and straight-edge alignments on the sea floor, in patterns that are difficult to attribute to natural geological processes. Advocates of alternative history theories connect these sites through a proposed framework. An ancient maritime civilization that existed during the late Ice Age and early post-glacial period, before conventional timelines placed the rise of complex societies. This civilization, they argue, was centred in regions that are now underwater or desert, regions that were habitable and even thriving during the different climate conditions of that era. The Younger Dryas event provides a potential mechanism for this civilization's destruction. Between approximately 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, Earth experienced a rapid cooling period that disrupted ecosystems worldwide. Sea levels rose as ice sheets melted and reformed in complex patterns. Coastlines changed dramatically. What had been fertile lowlands became ocean floor. What had been verdant landscapes became frozen or dried wastelands. If an advanced civilization had developed during the warmer period before the Younger Dryas, centred in coastal regions and river valleys, the climate catastrophe would have destroyed most traces of their existence. Coastal cities would have been submerged by rising seas. Interior settlements would have been abandoned as water sources disappeared. The survivors would have scattered to regions where they could still find resources, carrying with them fragmentary memories of what had been lost. This theory would explain why so many ancient cultures around the world have flood myths, why they describe lost golden ages, why they speak of advanced ancestors whose knowledge has been forgotten. It would explain the mysterious megalithic sites that seem too sophisticated for their supposed time periods. They might be remnants or echo constructions of that earlier lost civilization. The Risha structure fits perfectly into this framework. Positioned in what was once a green and fertile region, surrounded by rivers and possibly near an ancient inland sea, it would have been an ideal location for a major city during the Green Sahara period. As the climate changed and the desert advanced, the city would have been abandoned, its inhabitants dispersing to other regions, carrying stories of the great circular city they had left behind. Those stories would have travelled through generations, distorted and mythologized over thousands of years, until they reached Plato in ancient Greece as the legend of Atlantis, a great circular city destroyed by catastrophe, remembered in fragments, lost to time. Mainstream archaeology rejects this framework entirely, pointing to lack of physical evidence, problematic dating methods used by alternative researchers, and the tendency of pseudo-archaeology to connect unrelated sites through superficial similarities. They argue that advanced civilizations leave unmistakable traces, monumental construction, widespread artifact distributions, clear evidence of complex social organization. None of this has been found in the Sahara or in supposed Ice Age contexts. But the alternative researchers counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when large parts of the potential sites have never been thoroughly investigated. They point to the institutional barriers that prevent such investigation, and they ask why so much resistance exists if there is truly nothing to find. The debate continues, with neither side willing to concede ground. And in the centre of it all, the Risha structure remains, a perfect circle in the sand, waiting for someone to prove what it really is. The conspiracy deepens. In the age of the internet, information spreads in ways that were impossible in previous generations. Amateur researchers, armed with nothing more than freely available satellite imagery and persistent curiosity, began examining the Rishi structure with fresh eyes in the early 2000s. What they discovered sparked a wave of conspiracy theories that continue to proliferate across online forums and video platforms. several researchers noted that certain sections of satellite imagery covering the Richat structure appeared degraded or artificially blurred in ways not consistent with normal image processing. When they compared images from different satellite systems or different time periods, they found inconsistencies that suggested selective editing. High-resolution images that had been available in public databases suddenly became low-resolution, or were removed entirely from access. When questioned, satellite imaging companies and government agencies provided technical explanations, routine quality control, updated privacy standards, licensing restrictions from host countries. But the pattern was suspicious. Why would anyone care about privacy or image quality for a remote desert location with no military or commercial sensitivity? Deeper digging revealed another layer. Declassified intelligence documents from the Cold War era, released through various Freedom of Information requests, contained references to survey operations in Mauritania during the 1950s and 60s. Some of these documents mentioned the Richat structure specifically, noting it as a landmark for navigation and reconnaissance operations. But other documents, heavily redacted, reference something more intriguing. Field stations established near the formation, geological surveys conducted under intelligence oversight, and notations about subsurface anomalies that warranted further investigation. The details were blacked out, but the implications remained visible between the redactions. Why would intelligence agencies have taken interest in a geological formation in the middle of the Sahara Desert? During the Cold War, resources were precious and operations were focused on strategic value. Unless they knew or suspected there was something there worth investigating, something beyond simple geology. The conspiracy theories grew more elaborate. Some researchers claimed that early expeditions to the Richat structure had discovered artifacts or structures that proved advanced ancient civilization, and that these findings had been deliberately suppressed to avoid disrupting established historical narratives. Others suggested that what was found was even more extraordinary, evidence of technology that could not be explained by any known ancient culture, technology that implied outside influence or knowledge far beyond what should have been possible. Online forums buzzed with claims of metallic anomalies buried beneath the structure, of subsurface tunnels that honeycomb the formation, of inscriptions in unknown languages that were photographed and then removed under military escort. None of these claims came with verifiable evidence. No photographs, no documents, no credible first-hand witnesses. Just stories passed from forum to forum, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Skeptics pointed out the obvious. Conspiracy theories thrive in the absence of evidence. When investigation is restricted and information is scarce, speculation fills the void. The lack of proof becomes proof of its own kind in the paranoid logic of conspiracy thinking. Every missing document, every denied permit, every redacted file becomes confirmation that something is being hidden. But even skeptics had to admit that some aspects of the situation were genuinely strange. The satellite image irregularities could be verified by anyone with access to multiple imaging databases. The declassified intelligence documents were real, even if their meaning was unclear. The consistent denial of archaeological permits was documented and unexplained. Perhaps most tellingly, when journalists or documentary makers contacted government officials in Mauritania about the Richat structure and the Atlantis theories, they received responses that seemed oddly defensive. Instead of dismissing the claims with amusement or indifference, officials often reacted with hostility, warning against spreading misinformation or making accusations against the government. Why would bureaucrats care so much about a fringe theory unless there was something they wanted to protect? The conspiracy theories even extended to international organisations. Some researchers claimed that UNESCO and other heritage bodies were deliberately keeping the Richat structure in bureaucratic limbo, neither officially investigating it nor allowing others to do so. This kept the site in a permanent state of uncertainty, preventing any conclusions that might be controversial. Digital suppression became another layer of the conspiracy. researchers reported that detailed LiDAR scans and ground-penetrating radar data they had collected at the site were mysteriously deleted from cloud storage services or corrupted in ways that made recovery impossible. When they accused tech companies or government agencies of interference, they were told it was random data loss or user error, but too many researchers had the same experience for it to be coincidence. Internet forums began referring to the Richat structure as the most geo-fenced archaeological site on Earth, suggesting that powerful interests were using technology to control information flow about the location. Every time a particularly compelling piece of analysis or evidence appeared online, it would be flagged, disputed, or buried in search rankings until it became effectively invisible. Whether any of this represented real suppression or simply the natural friction between fringe theories and mainstream academia remained impossible to prove. But the perception of conspiracy was undeniable, and in the modern information landscape, perception often matters more than reality. The mystery had taken on a life of its own, independent of whatever truth might exist in the Saharan sand. The revelation that vanished. In recent years, advances in remote sensing technology have given researchers tools that previous generations could only dream of. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, can penetrate vegetation and see ground features invisible to normal observation. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal subsurface structures without disturbing the Earth. These technologies have revolutionized archaeology, discovering lost cities in jungles and hidden ruins beneath modern developments. Several independent research teams acquired access to this technology and turned their attention to the Richat structure. What they found reignited the entire debate about the site's origins. LiDAR mapping of the formation revealed features that were not visible in standard satellite imagery. Linear formations beneath the sand extending from the rings outward in radial patterns, too regular to be natural water channels. Rectangular anomalies in areas between the major rings, possibly indicating buried structures. Subsurface density variations that suggested human modification of the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be cavities and dense strata at depths, consistent with construction rather than geological formation. The patterns showed symmetry, an organisation that geological processes do not typically create. In several locations, the radar returns indicated possible walls or foundations beneath meters of accumulated sand and sediment. The researchers released their preliminary data online, posting detailed images and analysis to open access platforms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Researchers, enthusiasts, and curious observers from around the world began examining the data, offering interpretations and additional analysis. The conversation exploded across social media and academic forums. Within days, something strange happened. The original data files began disappearing from the platforms where they had been posted. Links went dead. Archive sites reported that the files had been removed for terms of service violations, though the specific violations were never clearly explained. Researchers who had downloaded the data found their copies corrupted or inaccessible. The teams who had conducted the scans reported harassment and intimidation. Anonymous messages warned them to stop their investigations, their funding. Sources received complaints about their work. Universities where some of them held positions suggested they focus on less controversial projects. The pressure came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an environment where continuing the research became professionally and personally risky. New restrictions appeared on access to remote sensing data for the region. Satellite imaging companies updated their terms of service to restrict use of their data for certain types of analysis in designated sensitive areas. The Richat structure was added to these restricted zones. Anyone requesting high-resolution imagery or attempting to use advanced analytical tools for the site found their access blocked or their results flagged for review. Digital elevation maps that had shown the detailed topography of the formation, maps that had been publicly available for years, suddenly vanished from open archives. The organisations that hosted these datasets claimed they were undergoing routine updates, or that licensing agreements had changed, but the maps never returned. What had once been freely accessible scientific data became unavailable, forcing researchers to rely on older, lower resolution alternatives. The accusations of digital suppression grew louder. Researchers claimed that international heritage agencies, possibly under pressure from the Mauritanian government or other interests, were actively scrubbing the internet of information that might support non-mainstream theories about the site. They documented patterns of content removal, search result manipulation, and access restrictions that went far beyond normal data management practices. Defenders of the organisations involved pointed out that data management decisions are complex, driven by multiple factors including privacy concerns, international agreements, and resource limitations. They argued that seeing conspiracy in routine bureaucratic actions was paranoid and counterproductive. If researchers wanted access to better data, they should work through proper channels rather than complaining about censorship. But the proper channels led nowhere. Applications for data access were denied or delayed indefinitely. Requests for clarification about policies went unanswered. The system seemed designed to prevent investigation rather than facilitate it. The situation created a paradox. The very restrictions and suppressions that alternative researchers complained about became evidence supporting their theories, while also making it impossible to gather the proof that would definitively settle the question. If the data showed nothing interesting, why restrict it? If the site was just geology, why fear investigation? The vanished revelation, data that existed briefly and then disappeared, became more powerful as a legend than it might have been as evidence. Every attempt to suppress information about the Richat structure only increased interest in what might be hidden there. And through it all, the formation itself remained unchanged, a circle of stone in an ocean of sand holding its secrets close. The legacy of the eye. More than 2,000 years after Plato wrote about Atlantis, we find ourselves no closer to definitive answers. The story has taken us from ancient Greek philosophy to Cold War intelligence operations, from geological surveys to conspiracy theories, from satellite imagery to digital suppression. Every answer raises new questions. Every piece of evidence admits multiple interpretations. The Richat structure may be exactly what mainstream science says it is, a fascinating but entirely natural geological formation, an eroded dome that coincidentally happens to match some details of a mythical city described by a philosopher who had no way of knowing about it. The correspondences could be nothing more than coincidence, the patterns nothing more than pareidolia, seeing meaning where none exists. Or it could be something else entirely. It could be the final resting place of humanity's first great civilization, a city that thrived during the Green Sahara period, a place of learning and culture that was abandoned when the climate shifted and the desert consumed everything. The stories of that city could have survived as oral tradition for thousands of years, passed from generation to generation until they reached Plato as the legend of Atlantis. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps there was a settlement at the Richat structure during the African humid period, nothing as grand as Plato described, but significant enough to leave memories. Perhaps the geological formation inspired myth-making among ancient peoples who saw it and tried to explain its perfect circles. Perhaps Atlantis is real in the sense that all myths are real, containing kernels of truth wrapped in layers of embellishment. What we know for certain is that the questions remain unanswered. The restrictions on research continue. The data stays suppressed or unavailable. The official explanations satisfy some, but leave others skeptical. The conspiracy theories proliferate in the vacuum of hard evidence. The Richat structure forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities about our own history. How much have we forgotten? How many civilizations rose and fell before the ones we acknowledge as the first? How much of what we call myth might be distorted memory of real events? We live in an age when we can photograph the surfaces of distant planets in extraordinary detail. yet we cannot seem to properly investigate a formation on our own world. We can decode ancient DNA and peer inside pyramids with cosmic rays, yet we cannot get permission to dig in a Saharan rock formation. The contradiction reveals something about how knowledge is controlled, how narratives are protected, how certain questions are discouraged even in an age that claims to celebrate scientific inquiry. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Rishi structure is not what it is, but why we're not allowed to find out. Every barrier to investigation, every missing data set, every denied permit becomes part of the story. The structure itself may be silent stone, but the silence around it speaks volumes. If there is nothing there, prove it. If it is just geology, demonstrate it conclusively. Open the site to thorough archaeological investigation. Release the data. Allow the research. Let the evidence speak for itself. If the Atlantis theories are wrong, serious investigation will prove it and put the matter to rest. But that is not what happens. Instead, we get obstruction, suppression, and silence. We get bureaucratic barriers and digital disappearances. We get warnings to stop asking questions and suggestions that certain topics are best left alone. Why? That single question hangs over the entire mystery. Why does anyone care what researchers conclude about a remote geological formation? Why do authorities react defensively to theories about ancient civilizations? Why are resources dedicated to controlling information about a place that supposedly has no significance? The answer may be simpler than any conspiracy theory suggests. Perhaps the problem is not what might be found, but what it would mean if it were found. A civilization that predates the accepted timeline of human history would require rewriting textbooks, reconsidering theories, acknowledging gaps in our understanding. It would mean admitting that our confidence in knowing the story of humanity was misplaced, that there are chapters of history we have not yet read. Institutions do not like admitting they were wrong. Established narratives resist change even in the face of contradictory evidence. Academic reputations are built on specific interpretations of history, and challenges to those interpretations are seen as attacks rather than opportunities for discovery. The machinery of institutional knowledge protects itself, not through deliberate conspiracy, but through simple bureaucratic inertia and the human resistance to paradigm shifts. Or perhaps it is more sinister. Perhaps early expeditions did find something at the Rishi structure, something that governments decided was too destabilizing to reveal. Perhaps the suppression is deliberate, coordinated, designed to keep humanity's true history hidden for reasons we can only guess at. We may never know which explanation is correct. We may spend generations debating the meaning of a circle in the sand, but the eye of the Sahara will remain, patient and unblinking, watching us struggle with the mystery it represents. Atlantis was never really about a lost city. It was about loss itself, about how time erases what we build, how nature reclaims what we create, how memory fades into myth and truth becomes legend. It was a warning about pride, about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly everything we know can be swept away. And somewhere in the Mauritanian desert, beneath rings of ancient stone and centuries of sand that warning waits, the first city of humankind, if it ever existed, does not call out to us. It simply exists, silent and forgotten, a reminder that we are not the first to walk this earth, with grand ambitions and powerful technologies. Others came before, others built great things, others were forgotten. We like to think we are different, that our civilization is permanent, that what we create will last forever. But the Rishi structure teaches a different lesson. It teaches that the earth is patient. It teaches that time is vast. It teaches that everything eventually becomes dust and mystery. Look up at satellite images of the formation, at that perfect bullseye staring back from the surface of our world. It looks like an eye because it is one. It is the eye of history itself watching us, waiting to see if we will remember what it remembers, if we will learn what it has to teach. The story of Atlantis ends the same way in every telling, with loss, with forgetting, with mystery. The story of the Risha structure may end the same way, buried under bureaucracy and silence rather than sand and time. But the questions it raises will not stay buried. They will continue to surface, generation after generation, until someone finally decides that the truth, whatever it is, matters more than maintaining comfortable certainties. Until that day comes, the Eye of Atlantis watches and waits, patient, eternal, unanswered. And perhaps, just perhaps, when we finally understand what we are looking at, we will also understand what we have been missing all along, the story of who we really are, written in rings of stone beneath an ocean of sand, waiting for someone brave enough to read it. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think differently about the past we think we know, consider what other truths might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. The world is full of mysteries, and the biggest mystery of all might be why we have stopped asking the questions that matter most. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never assume that history has already told you everything there is to know. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and finding it as fascinating as we do, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. It's not required, but we genuinely enjoy connecting with our global community. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a massive thank you to KD Lofty for suggesting this topic. This is one we've been wanting to cover for a long time, and your suggestion was the perfect push we needed. Imagine holding a secret so profound that releasing it could rewrite human history. Imagine being told to stay silent, not by choice, but by order. Now imagine that secret involves the most watched moment in television history, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and what 3 astronauts allegedly saw on the lunar surface that was never meant to reach the public. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive conspiracy theories ever to emerge from the space race, a missing transmission, a hidden film reel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity's first steps on the moon were also our first encounter with something we were never supposed to find. Apollo 11. The transmission they never released. Part 1. The engineer's confession. The fluorescent lights in the Euston diner flickered as journalist Marcus Webb sat across from a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world for 50 years. Ernest Hale was 83 years old, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh light, and his eyes, once sharp and calculating during his years as a NASA communications engineer, now held something different. Fear, regret, and an urgent need to unburden himself before time ran out. 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how much they cut. Marcus had received the cryptic email 3 weeks earlier. No details, just a time and a place, and a single line that had made his investigative instincts flare to life, like a signal fire in the darkness. I know what Armstrong really saw on the moon. As a journalist specialising in declassified government documents and Cold War-era conspiracies, Marcus had heard plenty of wild claims about Apollo 11. Most were easily debunked fantasies, the kind of stories that fell apart the moment you applied even basic scrutiny. But something about Hale's message felt different. The man had credentials, a verifiable 40-year career at NASA, working specifically in communications during the Apollo program. This wasn't some basement-dwelling theorist. This was someone who had been in the room. "You're telling me NASA deliberately cut audio from the moon landing broadcast?" Marcus asked, activating the voice recorder on his phone and sliding it across the table. Hale nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Not just audio. There was a complete transmission blackout for exactly 2 minutes and 42 seconds, right after Armstrong set foot on the surface. The public version shows a brief interruption, static, technical difficulties. That's the official story. But I was in the communications room that night. I heard everything. "And what did you hear?" The old man's hands tightened around his cup. Armstrong's voice, different than before, shaken. He said, and I quote, "They're here. They're watching us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm Texas evening. They? That's what he said. Houston immediately switched him to the medical channel, the encrypted line. Protocol was that channel was only for health emergencies, astronaut vital signs, things like that. But they used it for something else that day. They used it to have a conversation the world was never meant to hear. Marcus leaned forward, his journalistic skepticism warring with the undeniable conviction in Hale's voice. "Why are you telling me this now? Why wait 50 years? Hale's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I've kept this secret for half a century because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, afraid of being labelled a lunatic, afraid of what they might do to keep me quiet. But I'm out of time, and I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know the truth." The engineer reached into a worn leather satchel beside him and pulled out a manila folder, its edges frayed from age. Inside were photocopied pages, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be mission transcripts with entire sections blacked out. "This is everything I managed to save before they sanitized the records," Hale said, sliding the folder across the table. "Start with July 20th, 1969. Start with the real history, then I'll show you where the lies begin." Part 2. The Descent. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in the documented facts of Apollo 11, separating verifiable history from speculation. The mission had launched on July 16th, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, embarked on humanity's most ambitious journey. Their destination was the Sea of Tranquility, a vast lunar plain chosen for its relatively flat terrain. The early stages of the mission proceeded flawlessly. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, pushing the command module and lunar module out of Earth's orbit and onto a trajectory toward the moon. For 3 days, the crew travelled through the void of space, performing course corrections and systems checks, their every movement monitored by ground control in Houston. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and began their descent to the surface while Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting above. This was where the first anomaly occurred, one that was documented in the official records but never fully explained. As Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, computer alarms began screaming in the cramped cockpit. Error code 1201, then 1202. program alarms that indicated the guidance computer was being overwhelmed with data, receiving more information than it could process. In the official NASA narrative, these alarms were caused by a radar system inadvertently left on, flooding the computer with unnecessary data. Flight controllers in Houston made a split-second decision to proceed with the landing despite the alarms, trusting that the computer could handle the essential functions even while overloaded. But in Hale's documents, in the margins of a photocopied mission transcript, someone had written in pencil, "Alarms triggered by external scan. Eagle detected and scanned by." The question mark hung there, ominous and unfinished. Armstrong took manual control of Eagle, guiding it away from a boulder-strewn crater toward a smoother landing site. At this point, fuel was running critically low. The mission clock showed they had less than 30 seconds of landing fuel remaining when Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers in Houston. "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." The date was July 20th, 1969. The time was 8:17 post-meridium Universal Time. Humanity had reached the moon, but according to Hale, something was already waiting there. Part 3. The First Steps and the Missing Minutes. 6.5 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and began his careful descent down the ladder. The world watched grainy black and white images transmitted from a camera mounted on Eagle's exterior. An estimated 600 million people across the globe had their eyes fixed on television screens, witnessing something that had existed only in science fiction just a decade before. At 10:56 post-meridium Eastern Time, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. His words became instant history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The broadcast continued for several minutes, showing Armstrong's initial movements on the surface, his commentary about the fine, powdery consistency of the lunar soil, and his growing confidence in the low-gravity environment. Then, at approximately 11:02 post-meridium Eastern Time, the broadcast experienced what NASA described as a technical interruption. Static-filled television screens around the world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring CBS's coverage, assured viewers that engineers were working to restore the signal. The interruption lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds, just as Hale had said. When the feed returned, Armstrong was further from the lunar module, collecting samples, and everything appeared normal. The mission proceeded. Aldrin joined him on the surface. They planted the American flag, collected rocks, set up scientific instruments, and spoke with President Nixon via a radio hookup. Then they returned to Eagle, launched back to orbit, docked with Columbia, and began the journey home. The official explanation for the broadcast interruption was a temporary failure in the signal relay from the Australian tracking station at Honeysuckle Creek. Equipment malfunction. Nothing unusual. The missing minutes were simply dead air, static, an unfortunate technical glitch in an otherwise flawless broadcast. But Hale's documents told a different story. In the folder he'd given Marcus was a page that appeared to be from an internal NASA communications log. Most of it was standard technical jargon, signal strength readings, tracking data, confirmation of uplink and downlink status. But there was one entry, time-stamped at 11:01 post-meridium Eastern Time, that made Marcus's heart race. Switch to med channel on CDR request. Override standard protocol. Restricted transcript to follow. Public feed hold for 2.7 minutes. CDR commander. Neil Armstrong had requested the channel switch himself. And there was something else in the folder. A fragmentary transcript labelled Apollo 11 EVA Medical Channel Excerpt, July 20, 1969, 11:01 to 11:03 p.m. Eastern. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines covering entire paragraphs, but a few lines remained visible. Armstrong. Houston, there are other craft here. Repeat, other craft. Houston. Say again, Eagle. Armstrong. They're on the ridge. 3 of them. Lined up. They're watching us. Houston. Stand by, Eagle. Switching to... The rest was blacked out. Marcus read the fragment a dozen times, his mind racing. If this was authentic, if Armstrong had really reported seeing craft on the moon, then the implications were staggering. But he needed more than a photocopied document from a dying man. He needed corroboration. That's when Hale mentioned the second camera feed. Part 4. The hidden feed. According to Hale, there were 2 video channels transmitting from the Apollo 11 mission. The public feed, broadcast worldwide, originated from the camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage. But there was a second feed, encrypted and transmitted on a classified frequency, that went directly to a secure facility in Houston, with simultaneous feeds to Langley Air Force Base and the Pentagon. The second camera was inside Armstrong's helmet, Hale explained during their second meeting, this time at his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Houston. Part of the biomedical monitoring system officially. It was supposed to record the astronauts' field of view for training and debriefing purposes. But the real reason was reconnaissance. The Air Force wanted independent visual confirmation of everything the astronauts encountered. "And you saw this second feed?" Marcus asked. Hale nodded. "I was part of the team monitoring communications integrity. I had access to all the channels, including the restricted ones. When Armstrong made his first report about the craft, they switched the helmet camera feed to the main screen in the control room. That's when I saw them. Them. Structures. On a ridge about half a mile from the landing site, cylindrical, metallic. They weren't natural formations. The shadows they cast were geometric, precise, and while we watched, one of them moved." Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Moved how? It rotated, slowly, like it was tracking Armstrong's position. Then the feed cut out. Someone at a higher pay grade than me pulled the plug. When it came back online 30 seconds later, the camera was pointed at the ground. We never saw those structures again. "And no one said anything? No one questioned it?" Hale's expression hardened. 3 people in that room saw what I saw. 2 of them are dead now. The 3rd won't return my calls. We were told immediately after the mission that what we'd witnessed was classified under national security protocols. We signed additional non-disclosure agreements. We were reminded that violating those agreements would be considered treason. Marcus tried to process this. But why? If there were structures on the moon, artificial structures, why hide it? That would be the most significant discovery in human history. "Think about it," Hale said quietly. "July 1969. We're still in the Cold War. We've just beaten the Soviets to the moon by a matter of months. Now imagine announcing to the world that we found evidence of non-human intelligence up there. What happens? Panic? Maybe. But more importantly, what happens to the space race? Do the Americans and Soviets suddenly start cooperating? Do other nations demand access to lunar exploration? Do we lose our strategic advantage? So you're saying they covered it up for geopolitical reasons. I'm saying they covered it up because they didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these structures abandoned? Active? Were they watching us? Could they be hostile? The people making decisions decided it was safer to study this quietly, secretly, rather than denounce it to a world that wasn't ready. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. "I need to verify this. I need to talk to other people who were there." Hale smiled sadly. "Good luck. Most of them are dead or won't talk. But there's one person you might try. Rosa Klein. She worked in the NASA archives for 30 years. She might remember some things." Part 5. The Archivist's Evidence. Rosa Klein lived in a small apartment in Pasadena, California, surrounded by stacks of books, photographs, and memories of a lifetime spent preserving humanity's reach into space. She was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious when Marcus first contacted her. "Ernest Hale sent you?" she asked over the phone, her voice guarded. "I haven't spoken to Ernest in 20 years. Why would he send someone to me now?" "Because he's dying," Marcus said simply, "and he wants the truth to come out before he goes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally Klein sighed. "Come to Pasadena, we'll talk, but I'm not promising anything." 3 days later, Marcus sat in Klein's cramped living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that seemed wildly out of place given the conversation they were about to have. I worked in the NASA archives from 1972 to 2002, Clean began, her eyes distant with memory. My job was to catalogue, preserve, and maintain access to mission documentation, photographs, film, audio recordings, everything. Apollo 11 was before my time, but the documentation from that mission was extensive. Thousands of photographs, hours of film, telemetry data, mission reports. And you found something unusual? Marcus prompted. Clean set down her teacup carefully. In 1987, I was conducting a routine inventory of Apollo 11 photographic materials. We had recently digitised a batch of images, and I was cross-referencing the digital copies against the physical archives. That's when I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Missing images. The photo manifest, the official list of every photograph taken during the mission, listed several images that weren't in the archive. The designations were sequential, standard NASA format, as 11-something-something. But when I tried to locate the physical photographs, they were gone. And here's the strange part. The gaps in the sequence all fell within a specific time frame. Let me guess, Marcus said. Right after the landing? Klein nodded. The missing images were all from the first 40 minutes Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. I filed a report about the discrepancy. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me I'd made a mistake. The missing photos had never existed. The manifest I'd seen was an early draft that included planned photos that were never actually taken due to time constraints. But you didn't believe that? Of course not. I'd been doing that job for 15 years. I knew the difference between a preliminary photo plan and a completed mission manifest. But I also knew when to keep my mouth shut. I let go. Officially. And unofficially? Klein stood and walked to a bookshelf crammed with binders and folders. She pulled out a slim blue folder and handed it to Marcus. Inside was a photocopy of a document, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a photo manifest stamped with official NASA headers and dated August 5th, 1969. Marcus scanned the list of image designations, his pulse quickening as he saw the gaps Klein had mentioned. AS 11-43 through AS 11-51 were missing. 8 consecutive images. I made a copy before they sanitised the records, Klein said quietly. I knew someday someone would ask questions. I just didn't think it would take this long. What do you think those photos showed? Klein sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. I think they showed whatever Armstrong and Aldrin saw on that ridge. I think someone at NASA or the Pentagon decided those images were too sensitive to remain in the public archive, so they removed them and pretended they never existed. Marcus felt the pieces starting to come together, but he still needed more. Did you ever hear anything else? Rumours? Gossip? Anything about what might have been on those photos? Klein hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was an old technician, worked in photo processing during the Apollo era. He retired in the late 80s. We used to have lunch sometimes, talk shop. One day, after a few drinks, he told me about a special project he'd worked on. He called it the clean-up detail. Clean-up? His job was to retouch lunar surface photos before they were released to the public. NASA claimed it was just to enhance clarity, improve contrast, make the images more suitable for publication, but he said they were removing things, shadows that didn't match the terrain, reflections that couldn't be explained, dark silhouettes on distant horizons. Marcus's mind was racing. Did he say specifically what they were removing? He wouldn't give details, but he did say one thing I've never forgotten. He said the moon wasn't empty when we got there. He said it was never empty. Part 6. The Astronaut's Silence. Michael Collins, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew, orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. Every public account emphasized his isolation. The loneliest man in the universe, they called him, cut off from all human contact during his passes around the moon's far side. But according to Hale's documents, Collins made his own disturbing observations during those solitary orbits. Marcus tracked down a former NASA public affairs officer who'd worked with Collins during post-mission appearances. The man, who insisted on anonymity, agreed to meet at a bar in Clear Lake, Texas, not far from the Johnson Space Center. Collins was different after Apollo 11, the former officer said, nursing a beer and keeping his voice low despite the noise of the sports bar around them. Armstrong and Aldrin got all the attention, obviously, but Collins was the one who seemed most affected by the experience. He did the appearances, the tours, the press conferences, but there was something in his eyes, like he'd seen something that changed him. Did he ever talk about it? Marcus asked. Not publicly, but there were private moments. I travelled with him for 2 years after the mission, helping coordinate media appearances. One night we're in a hotel in Tokyo, both of us jet-lagged, sitting in the bar at 3 a.m. He's had a few drinks, more than usual, and he starts talking about the far side of the moon. Marcus leaned closer. What did he say? He said being on the far side was strange. Total radio silence from Earth, from Houston, from the lunar module. Just him and the cosmos. He said that's when he saw it. Saw what? The former officer took a long drink before answering. A light, moving alongside Columbia. At first he thought it was debris, part of the spacecraft, or maybe something from the lunar module, but it paced him. Matched his orbital velocity perfectly. Stayed at a constant distance. He watched it for 3 complete orbits. Then, right as he was about to come back around to the near side, it accelerated and disappeared. Did he report it? He said he did, on the private channel once he re-established contact with Houston. They told him it was probably space junk or an optical illusion from the sun reflecting off particles. But Collins didn't buy it. He said he knew what space debris looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. This was something watching him. Marcus felt his excitement building. Is there any record of this report? The former officer shook his head. If there is, it's buried deep. Collins never mentioned it publicly. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one he told. There were others over the years. People he trusted. We all signed NDAs, promised never to discuss conversations we had with the astronauts. But I figure after 50-some years, and with you already digging into this, maybe it's time. Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus reviewed everything he'd gathered so far. Hale's testimony about the transmission blackout and the helmet camera feed. Klein's evidence of missing photographs and image manipulation. Now Collins's unreported sighting in lunar orbit. The pattern was becoming clear. Multiple independent sources all pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened during Apollo 11 that was deliberately concealed from the public. But he still needed the smoking gun. He needed direct testimony from one of the astronauts themselves. That's when he remembered Hale mentioning Buzz Aldrin. Part 7. The Aldrin Interview. Buzz Aldrin was the second human to walk on the moon, and over the decades since Apollo 11, he'd become known for his candour, his willingness to speak about his experiences and struggles. He'd discussed his battles with depression and alcoholism, his frustrations with NASA, bureaucracy, his thoughts on the future of space exploration. And on a few notable occasions he'd hinted at something unusual during the Apollo 11 mission. Marcus found a reference to a 1996 interview that Aldrin had done with a small aerospace magazine. The interview had never been published, supposedly due to editorial disagreements. But the journalist who conducted it, a woman named Patricia Hammond, was still alive and working as a freelance writer in Florida. When Marcus called her, Hammond's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't talk about that interview. I signed an agreement." "With NASA?" Marcus asked. "With lawyers representing NASA. They made it very clear that certain portions of my conversation with Aldrin were not suitable for publication. They compensated me for my time and my silence." "But you still have the recording?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Maybe." It took 3 more phone calls, a promise to keep her name out of any publication, and a wire transfer of $5,000 before Hammond agreed to send Marcus a digital copy of the suppressed portion of the interview. What he heard made his hands shake. The interview audio was scratchy, clearly recorded on older equipment, but the voices were clear. Hammond asking questions, Aldrin answering thoughtfully, until she asked about the famous UFO sighting during Apollo 11. In public statements over the years, Aldrin had acknowledged seeing something unusual during the flight to the moon, but always with caveats. It was probably a panel from the spacecraft separation. It could have been debris, nothing definitive. But in this unpublished interview, his tone was different. Hammond: there's been a lot of speculation about what you saw on the way to the moon. Can you describe it? Aldrin: we saw something. All three of us. It was following us, maintaining distance. It wasn't debris, because debris doesn't maintain formation. It wasn't the Saturn IV panel, because we could see that tumbling away in a different direction. Hammond: what did it look like? Aldrin: cylindrical, metallic. When the sun hit it at certain angles, it was brilliant. Other times it was dark, almost invisible. We reported it to Houston on a private channel. Hammond: and what did Houston say? Aldrin: they told us not to discuss it publicly. They said it would cause unnecessary panic. But that wasn't the strangest part. Hammond: what was the strangest part? Aldrin: long pause. When we landed on the moon, there were 3 more of them, on the ridge, just like the one that followed us. Same shape, same size, like they were waiting. Hammond: you reported this as well? Aldrin: of course. Neil did, immediately. That's when they cut the public feed and put us on the encrypted channel. They didn't want the world to hear what we were describing. Hammond: what did you describe? Aldrin: structures, technology, something that definitely wasn't human. We were told very clearly that this information was classified under national security protocols. We were told that discussing it could jeopardize not just the space program, but national security itself. Hammond: and you've kept quiet all these years? Aldrin: what choice did I have? You think I wanted to be labelled a crackpot? You think I wanted to spend the rest of my life being questioned about little green men? But I'll tell you this, what we saw was real. It was there. And someone needs to find out what it was and why we were told to stay silent. The recording ended there. According to Hammond, that's when Aldrin's publicist had intervened, ended the interview, and initiated the legal process to suppress the recording. Marcus listened to it 5 more times, making detailed notes. This was it. Direct testimony from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, on record, describing exactly what Hale had claimed: the structures on the ridge, the encrypted communication channel, the directive to remain silent, but he still needed to know what happened next. What did NASA do with this information? Where did it go? The answer, according to Hale, lay in a classified debriefing that took place 8 days after the astronauts returned to Earth. Part 8. The Secret Debriefing. On July 28, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their official mission debrief at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The public version of this debrief covered technical aspects of the flight, equipment performance, scientific observations, and recommendations for future missions. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been publicly available for decades. But according to documents Hale provided, there was a second classified debriefing that same day. This one took place in a secure conference room with only select personnel present. No press, no public record. And according to a fragmentary transcript Hale had managed to preserve, the discussion was explosive. The partial transcript Marcus received was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Classified debriefing, Apollo 11. Crew date, July 28, 1969. Location, Building 30, Manned Spacecraft Center. Present, redacted, redacted. N. Armstrong, E. Aldrin, M. Collins, redacted. Redacted. Gentlemen, this session is classified top secret. Nothing discussed here leaves this room. Is that understood? Armstrong. Understood. Redacted. Commander Armstrong, please describe in detail what you observed at 11:01 Eastern Time on July 20th. Armstrong. After exiting the LM and conducting initial surface assessment, I observed 3 cylindrical objects on a ridge approximately 0.8 kilometers from our position. The objects were metallic in appearance, vertical orientation, approximately redacted. Size estimate, Armstrong. Difficult to gauge at that distance, but estimated between 40 and 60 feet in height. They were arranged in a linear pattern, evenly spaced, redacted. Movement, Armstrong. The centre object appeared to rotate slowly. The rotation was observable due to a reflective surface that caught sunlight intermittently. I observed this for approximately 90 seconds before Houston requested channel switch. Redacted. Colonel Aldrin, did you observe these objects as well? Aldrin, yes. When I exited the LM approximately 20 minutes later, I looked toward the ridge Armstrong had described. The objects were still visible. I observed what appeared to be independent illumination, a glow that wasn't consistent with solar reflection. Collins, I'd like to add something. Redacted. Go ahead. Collins. During my solo orbits, I observed a similar object maintaining position relative to Columbia. This was consistent across multiple orbits. The object matched our velocity and altitude precisely. When I reported this, I was instructed to... The transcript cuts off here. The remainder of the document was missing, but Hale had provided context in his notes. According to him, the debriefing had concluded with explicit instructions to the crew. They were to maintain absolute silence about their observations. They were told that investigation into the phenomena was ongoing at the highest levels of government, and that premature disclosure could compromise both national security and the space program itself. The astronauts had complied. For 50 years they'd carried the secret. But the government's investigation, according to Hale, had continued in the shadows. Part 9. The Pentagon Connection. The Defense Intelligence Agency had maintained close oversight of the Apollo program from its inception. While NASA was a civilian agency, the military implications of space exploration were obvious. Reconnaissance, communications, potential weapons platforms, all of these fell within DoD's purview. So when Apollo 11 reported anomalous objects on the lunar surface, it was the DIA that took the lead in analysing the implications. Marcus managed to track down a former DIA analyst who'd worked on aerospace intelligence during the late 1960s. The man, who insisted on using only the pseudonym Thomas, agreed to speak on condition of complete anonymity. The Apollo 11 findings triggered a complete reassessment of our understanding of the lunar environment, Thomas said during their secure video call. We'd been sending probes to the moon since the early 60s, Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter. None of them had detected anything unusual. No structures, no anomalies. So when the Apollo crew reported what they saw, the initial reaction was skepticism. But they investigated, Marcus asked. Extensively. We pulled every photograph, every piece of telemetry data, every communication transcript. We analysed sun angles, shadow patterns, optical illusions. We even considered the possibility that the crew was hallucinating. Some kind of psychological break from the stress of the mission. But you couldn't explain it away. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, the evidence was too consistent. 3 trained observers, all reporting the same phenomena independently. Visual confirmation from multiple angles. And then there were the photographs. The missing photographs from the archive, Marcus prompted. Those photos weren't missing. They were moved, classified. I saw some of them during the initial analysis. They showed exactly what the crew described. Cylindrical structures, geometric precision, surface composition inconsistent with natural lunar formations. So what did you conclude? Officially? The analysis was inconclusive. We couldn't definitively prove the objects were artificial, so we couldn't justify public disclosure. Unofficially, every analyst who saw that data knew we were looking at something that didn't belong there, something that predated our arrival. Alien technology, Thomas laughed bitterly. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? But here's the thing that bothered us most. The objects weren't ancient. They weren't covered in lunar dust. They weren't degraded by micrometeorite impacts or radiation. They looked new, which meant either they were recently placed there, or they were maintained somehow. That's terrifying. It gets worse. We analysed the trajectory of the object Collins reported shadowing the command module. Based on its behaviour, matching orbital velocity, maintaining precise distance, it would have required sophisticated propulsion and guidance systems. More sophisticated than anything we had at the time. Maybe more sophisticated than anything we have now. Marcus felt a chill run through him. So what happened? Where did the investigation go from there? Above my pay grade, Thomas said. The analysis was kicked up to a special projects division. I heard rumours it was folded into a broader programme studying unexplained aerial phenomena, what we called UAPs, but the specifics were compartmentalised, need to know only, and I didn't need to know. Do you think we went back? Secretly? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We had 6 more Apollo missions after 11. 5 of them successfully landed on the moon. If I were running the program, I would have absolutely sent crews to investigate those structures, get closer, get better images, maybe even attempt contact. But whether that actually happened, I have no idea. The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it confirmed a crucial point. The Pentagon had taken the Apollo 11 observations seriously enough to launch a classified investigation, which meant the government believed something real had been detected on the moon. Now he needed to know what they found. Part 10. The Photo Laboratory. Following a lead from Rosa Klein, Marcus travelled to the former, site of Building 8 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. The building no longer existed, demolished in the early 2000s during a facilities modernization project. But Klein had given him a name, Victor Reeves, a former photo technician who'd worked in Building 8 during the Apollo era. Reeves was 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus called, the old man's voice was surprisingly strong and clear. "Building 8, Reeves said with a dry chuckle. "Haven't thought about that place in years. What's your interest?" Marcus explained his investigation, mentioning Hale's claims about photo manipulation and Klein's discovery of missing images. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions. Yeah, I worked the photo lab in Building 8 from 67 to 73. And yeah, we did cleanup work on Apollo images. Lots of it. Can you describe what that involved?" Officially, we were enhancing image quality, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing artifacts from the development process. And we did do that work. But there was another project. Smaller team, higher security clearance. We called it the Anomaly Review, which involved taking lunar surface photographs and removing anything that didn't fit the expected profile. And before you ask, yes, that included things that appeared artificial, geometric shapes, reflective surfaces where there shouldn't be reflections, shadows that didn't match the sun angle. We'd airbrush them out, retouch the surrounding terrain to make it look natural. How many photos are we talking about? From Apollo 11 specifically? Maybe 20, 25 images, but it continued through the other missions. By the end of the Apollo program, we'd cleaned up hundreds of photos. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Did you keep any of the originals? Before the retouching?" Reeves laughed. "Are you kidding? Everything was tracked. Every original, every work print, every final version. They ran inventory checks weekly. Taking anything out of that lab would have been instant dismissal and probably criminal charges. So there's no way to see what was removed?" "I didn't say that." Reeves paused. "Look, I was young, curious, and I had access to a camera. I may have photographed a few work prints before we retouched them. Just for my own records, you understand. Nothing official." Marcus could barely breathe. "You still have those photographs?" "Maybe. They're old, faded. Been sitting in a box in my garage for 50 years. But if you want to come out to Arizona, I suppose I could dig them out." 2 days later, Marcus was sitting in Reeves's small garage, looking at faded Polaroid images that showed the lunar surface before NASA's cleanup crew got to work. The images were exactly as Reeves had described. Angular shadows that didn't match the terrain, bright. Reflections from areas that should have been in darkness. And in 3 photos, clear geometric shapes on distant ridges. One image in particular made Marcus's hand shake. It showed the horizon beyond the Apollo 11 landing site, and there, unmistakably, were 3 vertical structures arranged in a line. The resolution wasn't good enough to show fine details, but the basic shapes were clear. Cylindrical, metallic, utterly inconsistent with natural geology. "That's what you were looking for, isn't it?" Reeves said quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "Keep it," Reeves said. "I'm too old to care about NDAs anymore. If someone wants to prosecute an 80-year-old man for showing you a 50-year-old photo, let them try. The world deserves to know the truth. Part 11. Armstrong's Warning. The deeper Marcus dug into the Apollo 11 cover-up, the more he understood why the astronauts had remained silent for so long. The pressure applied to them hadn't just been bureaucratic or legal, it had been personal and intense. He found evidence of this in an unexpected place: the private papers of a former NASA administrator that had been donated to a university archive. Buried in routine correspondence from the 1970s was a memo from a DA liaison to NASA leadership, marked Eyes Only. The memo, dated April 3, 1970, outlined recommended protocols for managing astronaut testimony regarding classified mission observations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Astronauts who discussed their observations publicly would face administrative consequences, including loss of flight status, pension review, and potential criminal prosecution under espionage laws. But there was one instance where the pressure had almost broken. Marcus discovered this through an interview with the widow of a former NASA public affairs officer. Her husband had died in 2008, but she remembered a story he'd told her about Neil Armstrong at a White House event in 1985. "My husband said Armstrong had been drinking more than usual that night," she recalled. "There was a small reception after the main event, just a few dozen people. Armstrong was talking with some aerospace contractors, and my husband overheard him say something strange. He said, 'We were warned away. They didn't want us there.'" "Warned by who?" Marcus asked. "That's what my husband asked, but Armstrong just shook his head and walked away." The next day, my husband got a call from Armstrong's assistant, asking if he'd overheard anything unusual at the reception. When my husband asked why, the assistant said Armstrong had been under stress and may have made some inappropriate comments. They wanted to make sure nothing made it into the media. "Did your husband report what he heard?" "Not officially, but he told me he always wondered what Armstrong meant. Warned away by who and why?" The answer might have come from another source, a colleague of Armstrong's from his test pilot days who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The man, who asked not to be named, told Marcus about a conversation he'd had with Armstrong in the late 1990s. Neil was different after Apollo 11, the former pilot said. Quieter, more withdrawn. He did his public duties, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. One day I asked him point blank, I said, "Neil, what really happened up there?" And he just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Some things are bigger than one man's conscience." What did he mean by that? I think he meant that he knew things the world should probably know, but that revealing them would cause more harm than good, or at least that's what he'd been convinced of. Part 12. The Final Evidence. Ernest Hale died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after his first meeting with Marcus. The cancer had progressed faster than the doctors predicted, but before he died, he made one final arrangement. Marcus received a package from Hale's attorney 3 days after the funeral. Inside was a small aluminum case, the kind used for storing film reels, and a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. Inside this case is the most important piece of evidence I managed to save. I've kept it hidden for 50 years, moving it from one secure location to another, always afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. The truth matters more than my reputation or my legacy. Ernest." Inside the aluminum case was a 16mm film reel, carefully sealed in archival plastic. A label on the reel read, "Apollo 11, EVA restricted, do not duplicate." Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully removed the reel. He'd anticipated this moment, prepared for it by locating a restoration specialist who could safely digitize old film stock. 2 days later, he sat in the specialist's darkened studio and watched the film play on a modern screen. The footage was grainy, occasionally jumping and flickering with age, but it was unmistakably from the lunar surface. The perspective was from Armstrong's helmet camera, the same feed Hale had described seeing in the communications room. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, July 20th, 1969. The camera panned across the lunar landscape, grey regolith stretching to a sharp horizon against the black sky. Then the view shifted, focusing on a distant ridge. The image was shaky, affected by Armstrong's breathing and movement, but there was no mistaking what appeared in frame. 3 cylindrical structures, exactly as described in all the testimonies Marcus had gathered. They were metallic, catching the harsh sunlight and casting precise geometric shadows on the lunar surface. The centre structure appeared to be rotating slowly, its surface reflecting light in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the audio kicked in, scratchy and broken but audible. A voice, Armstrong's, tight with tension. "Houston, do you copy this feed?" Static, then another voice from Houston. "We copy, Eagle. Maintain visual contact." Armstrong again. "It's moving, the centre one, it's rotating toward my position." Another voice, Aldrin's, in the background. "Neil, it's tracking you, it's definitely tracking you." Houston. "Stand by, Eagle, we're analysing." The camera continued to focus on the structures for another 30 seconds. Then suddenly the centre structure seemed to flare with light, a brilliant reflection that washed out the camera for several frames. When the image cleared, the camera was pointed at the ground. Armstrong's breathing was audible, rapid and shallow. Houston. "Eagle, redirect to surface sample collection. Acknowledge." Armstrong. "Acknowledged." The footage ran for another 10 seconds, showing only lunar soil, then cut to black. Marcus watched the film 6 times in total, making detailed notes, capturing screenshots, ensuring he had documented every frame. This was it. Physical evidence of exactly what Hale, Aldrin, and the others had described. It wasn't proof of alien life, but it was undeniable proof that something anomalous had been present on the moon during Apollo 11, and that NASA had deliberately concealed it. But as Marcus prepared to publish his findings, as he compiled all the evidence he'd gathered over 6 months of intensive investigation, something happened that changed everything. Part 13, The Message. The email arrived at 3:37 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake with its notification chime. The sender was listed as Concerned Observer, and the subject line read, "Before you publish." Marcus opened it with growing dread. "Marcus Webb, we know what you found. We know about Hale's testimony, Klein's documents, the Aldrin interview and the film. We've been watching your investigation with interest. Before you make the decision to release this information publicly, you should know something that Ernest Hale didn't. You should know what Apollo 12 found at the Ocean of Storms." The email included a single attachment, a PDF file with a simple title, Surveyor 3 Recovery Mission, Classified Addendum. Apollo 12 had landed on the moon in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. One of its mission objectives was to reach the Surveyor 3 probe, an unmanned lander that had touched down in April 1967. The astronauts successfully retrieved parts of Surveyor 3, bringing them back to Earth for analysis. That was the public story. The classified addendum told a very different tale. According to the document, when the Apollo 12 crew reached Surveyor 3, they found something unexpected. The probe had been moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet from its original landing site, but it had definitely been relocated deliberately, carefully, and then set down in a new position. More disturbing, Surveyor 3's camera, which had been pointed west in all the original mission images from '67, was now pointed northeast, toward a series of geometric formations that hadn't been visible in the original photographs. The Apollo 12 crew had photographed these formations extensively, and the classified addendum included several of those images. They showed structures similar to what Armstrong and Aldrin had seen, cylindrical objects arranged in patterns, some partially buried in lunar regolith, others standing free. But there was one crucial difference. These structures appeared older, weathered, covered in the fine dust that accumulates on the lunar surface over time. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. Evidence suggests long-term presence of non-terrestrial technology on the lunar surface. Origin, purpose, and current operational status remain unknown. Recommend continued classified investigation and absolute suppression of public disclosure, pending comprehensive threat assessment. The email's message continued below the attachment. "This is just the beginning, Marcus. Apollo 14 found more. Apollo 15 made contact. Apollo 16 was warned to leave. Apollo 17 discovered why. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will be forced to release the complete record. Are you prepared for the world to know everything? Think carefully about what you're about to do. The email ended with no signature, no contact information, no way to respond. Marcus sat in his dark apartment staring at the screen, his mind racing. The implication was clear. There was far more to the lunar cover-up than just Apollo 11. The evidence he'd gathered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended through the entire Apollo program and possibly beyond. If he published his Apollo 11 findings, whoever sent this email, presumably someone within the intelligence community, with access to the full classified record, would retaliate by releasing even more explosive information. Information about contact, about warnings, about discoveries that might fundamentally challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Was he ready for that? Was the world ready for that? He thought about Ernest Hale, who'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of this secret, dying with the hope that the truth would finally emerge. He thought about the astronauts who'd been silenced, threatened, forced to deny what they'd witnessed. He thought about the public's right to know, weighed against the potential chaos that full disclosure might unleash. As dawn broke over his apartment window, Marcus sat at his computer, his article complete and ready to publish. Everything he'd found, every interview, every document, the film footage, all of it compiled into a comprehensive expose that would change history. His finger hovered over the publish button. On his other screen, the email from Concerned Observer remained open, its threat hanging in the digital air like a sword. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will release the complete record. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career searching for the truth, exposing secrets, bringing hidden information into the light. But now, faced with the biggest story of his life, he found himself paralysed by a terrible question. What if some truths are too dangerous to tell? The cursor blinked on the screen. Publish. Don't publish. The choice that would define his legacy and possibly humanity's future. Outside, the sun rose over another ordinary day, in a world that had no idea what secrets lurked in the shadows of its greatest achievement. Marcus's finger remained frozen over the keyboard. The film reel sat in its aluminum case on his desk, 3 cylindrical structures captured forever on 16mm film, rotating slowly under an alien sun, watching, waiting, as they had been for 50 years. And somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, the complete record of humanity's first contact waited in the darkness, neither confirmed nor denied, neither revealed nor forgotten, existing in that strange quantum state of truth that is simultaneously known and unknown, believed and doubted, terrifying and magnificent. The story of Apollo 11, the transmission they never released, remained balanced on the edge of revelation, as close to the light as it had ever been, and yet still shrouded in the same shadows that had concealed it since that July day in 1969, when 3 men looked up at structures on a lunar ridge and had their reality forever transformed. Marcus Webb stared at his screen, the weight of history pressing down on him, the future hanging in the balance, and the cursor blinked. Publish. Don't publish. The choice was his alone, but the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, continued to exist independent of his decision, waiting in the lunar dust, patient and eternal, for the day when humanity would finally be ready to face what it had found among the stars.